Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There is a city that sits right on the edge of the world. Not the edge the way poets mean it, with sunsets and open ocean and the smell of something beautiful just beyond the horizon. No, this is the edge the way nightmares mean it. The edge where everything decent falls off and shatters on the rocks below. That city is called Ciudad Juarez. It sits on the southern bank of the Rio Grande in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, pressed right up against El Paso, Texas, like two people sharing a wall in an apartment building. Except one side of that wall hears lullabies and the other hears screaming. For years, Juarez held the title that no city ever wants. The most dangerous city on earth. Not in a film, not in a novel. In real, documented, verified, counted body by body, grieving family by grieving family, truth. And somewhere inside that city, at the peak of its violence, during the years when the streets were so thick with blood that the morning newspapers stopped listing individual murders and started printing them in columns like stock market numbers, there was a man. He did not look dangerous. That was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing about him. He looked like someone's neighbor. He looked like the man who waves from his driveway on Sunday mornings, the one who helps carry grocery bags, who nods politely at the school gate. He was ordinary in the way that certain predators are ordinary, the ones who survive by blending into the world they are destroying. This man had buried more than 250 bodies. He had tortured people in rooms you will never see. He had delivered death with the calm efficiency of someone performing a routine job, because to him, that is exactly what it was. A job, a craft, a calling, even. And then one afternoon, in a motel room near the border, with the curtains drawn against the bright desert sun, he sat across from a journalist and began to talk. What you are about to hear is that conversation. It is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. It is the story of how a human being becomes something else entirely. The story of how a system devours its children and turns them into weapons. The story of a city and a war and a man who lived inside both for 20 years and somehow came out the other side. Changed, damaged, haunted, but alive. His name is not important. He asked that his identity be protected, and the journalist who spoke with him, who spent months trying to earn even a fraction of this man's trust, agreed to those terms. He will be called simply the Sicario. That word, Sicario, carries more weight than most people realize. It does not simply mean hired killer, though that is the modern translation. The word goes back to ancient Palestine, to a group called the Sicarii, Jewish assassins who had curved daggers called psychi beneath their robes in the 1st century. They moved through crowds. They pressed close. They struck. They vanished. The blade and the invisibility. 2,000 years later, the word had crossed an ocean and a continent and found a new home in the desert borderlands of northern Mexico. And the men who wore that name now did not carry daggers. They carried everything else. The journalist who arranged this meeting had been working the border for years. He had covered massacres. He had written about mass graves. He had filed stories that woke editors up at midnight and sent lawyers scrambling for the phones. But nothing had prepared him for the process of actually finding this man, or for the weeks of coded phone calls and switching locations and the sick, crawling feeling that he was being watched at every moment. Because he was. That was the first thing the Sicario would teach him. In this world, you are always being watched. The moment you stop believing, that is the moment you stop breathing. The call started coming in the way things always start in this story. Not with a knock at the door. Not with a formal introduction. They started the way secrets always start. Quietly. Sideways. With a message passed through someone who knew someone. With a number scrawled on a napkin. With a phone that only rang once and went silent if you did not answer immediately. The journalist answered. He answered every time. And slowly, over a period of weeks that felt like years, the distance between him and this story began to close. There were rules. There were always rules in this world. Do not use the Sicario's real name. Do not photograph his face. Do not write down the name of the motel until you are already inside it. Come alone. Come exactly on time. Come knowing that if anything feels wrong, you will not be given a second chance to feel anything at all. The journalist agreed to every condition. He was terrified. He went anyway, because some stories are bigger than fear. The motel was not dramatic. That was what struck him first when he finally walked through that parking lot in the flat, merciless heat of a borderland afternoon. There were trucks parked outside with American plates. There was a vending machine humming near the ice room. There were birds in the scrubby little tree by the office. The ordinary world doing its ordinary things, completely unaware of what was happening behind door number 164. The journalist had been told the room number the night before, delivered in a voice so flat and expressionless it sounded like a machine. Room 164. Knocked twice. Wait. He knocked twice. He waited. The door opened, and the man was standing there, and for a moment the journalist could not fully process what he was seeing. He had expected something. He did not know what, exactly. Something to give it away. Some shadow in the eyes, some set of the jaw, some animal stillness that would signal what this man was. There was nothing like that. There was just a man of middle height and middle age, wearing plain clothes, with a quiet face and steady hands, who stepped back from the doorway and said, in a voice that was almost gentle, "Come in. Sit down. We have a lot to talk about." The journalist sat. The Sicario sat across from him. Between them was a small round table, a legal pad, and a thick black marker that the Sicario would pick up and put down dozens of times over the hours that followed, drawing diagrams, sketching hierarchies, mapping the invisible geography of the world he had lived inside. The curtains were pulled shut. The room smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and stale air. And then the Sicario folded his hands on the table, looked at the journalist with eyes that revealed absolutely nothing, and said the words that began everything. "I have dug graves for over 250 bodies." He said it the way someone else might say the weather forecast. No emphasis, no drama, no flicker of what you might expect to find in a person's face when they say something like that. He said it, and then he waited, watching the journalist the way a hawk watches something moving in the grass below, assessing, calculating, deciding whether this man across from him was useful or useless, honest or deceptive, brave or merely performing bravery. The journalist did not speak for a moment. He was thinking about those words. 250 bodies. He was thinking about the arithmetic of that, about what it means to place a human being in the earth 250 times, about the weight of dirt, about the silence that replaces a voice, about the families. The journalist had a daughter. He was thinking about her then, in that room, with that man, and he was trying very hard not to let any of that show on his face. "How long did that take?" he finally asked. The Sicario tilted his head very slightly to one side. 20 years, he said. "Give or take. 20 years. The journalist did a rough calculation he would rather not have done, and then put it away somewhere he could not reach during the interview. He had questions. He had a list of them, careful and organized, the product of weeks of preparation. But something told him, in that first charged minute in that room, that lists were useless here, that this man would tell his story in his own order, at his own pace, on his own terms, and that the journalist's job was not to direct, but to follow, to walk into the dark and not flinch, or at least, not flinch visibly. The Sicario leaned back in his chair. He seemed relaxed. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all, the relaxation of a man who had made peace with everything he had done, not by forgetting it, not by denying it, but by simply accepting it the way you accept the weather or the shape of your hands. It happened. It was what it was. He had his reasons. They may not have been your reasons. They may not have been anyone's reasons that you would recognize, but they were his. "You want to know how it starts?" the Sicario said. It was not a question. "Yes," the journalist said. The Sicario picked up the black marker. He drew a single dot on the legal pad. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up. "It starts," he said quietly, "with wanting to eat." Ciudad Juarez in the 1980s was not the kind of place that offered many futures. It offered the present, and the present was hard. The streets were dusty and loud and full of the particular desperation of a border city, a place that exists in the gap between two worlds and belongs fully to neither. To the north, across the brown ribbon of the Rio Grande, was El Paso, Texas, with its American supermarkets and its air conditioning and its gleaming chain restaurants and its sense that life, whatever its difficulties, was fundamentally organized towards something better. To the south, spreading back into the Mexican interior, were the hills and the poverty and the maquiladoras, The factories where people worked 12-hour shifts for wages that a person in El Paso might spend on a single meal, and where the workers went home each night to neighborhoods without paved roads and houses without reliable water, and where the gap between what you had and what the television told you was possible felt less like a distance and more like a wound. The Sicario was born into a family that was poor but not broken. That distinction mattered to him enormously. He made it several times during the hours he spoke to the journalist, with a quiet insistence that suggested he had spent years thinking about it. He was not abused. He was not neglected. He did not grow up in a house where violence was normalized, where a father's fist was the first lesson a child learned about power. His parents worked. His mother kept the house running with a kind of relentless competence that he described with the closest thing to warmth that ever crossed his face during the entire interview. His father got up before dawn and came home after dark and said little and provided what he could, which was not much but was consistent and honest. There were 7 of us. The Sicario told the journalist. 7 children. My mother cooked beans almost every night. Sometimes rice. Sometimes nothing. We were hungry sometimes, but we were not starving. I want you to understand the difference. I am not going to sit here and tell you that I became what I became because the world had no choice for me. That is what people say when they want to be forgiven before they have finished confessing. I had choices. They were just small ones. The journalist wrote that down. He would come back to it many times in the months after that conversation, turning it over in his hands the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath. He had heard many explanations for violence in the years he had spent covering the border. He had heard poverty cited and family breakdown cited and systemic injustice cited and the failure of institutions cited. All of those things were real. All of those things were true factors in the machinery that produced men like the one sitting across from him. But what this man was offering was something different. He was not offering an excuse. He was offering an explanation, and the two are not the same thing, though they are often confused. The Sicario was 16 years old when he first saw what money could actually do. Not money in the abstract, not the idea of money that you pick up from television or from watching the SUVs drive through the nice neighborhoods on the other side of the city, but real money, in someone's hands, earned in a single afternoon. He was in school then, still nominally a student, though school had already begun to feel like a room he was visiting rather than a place he belonged. He was smart. He knew he was smart. And there is a particular kind of frustration that comes from being smart in a place that has no use for your intelligence, a frustration that is different from ordinary boredom, that has an edge to it, a pressure that builds. The boy who changed everything was not a criminal, not exactly, not yet. He was just a little older, a little sharper, a little more connected than the other boys in the neighborhood. He wore better clothes. He had a phone at a time when phones were rare. He always had food, and he was generous with it, which is a particular kind of power in a place where hunger is real. He found the Sicario one afternoon near the school gate and looked at him the way someone looks at a tool they are thinking about picking up. He asked me if I wanted to make some money. The Sicario said, "Not a lot, just enough." He said I would drive a car from one place to another. That was all. Just drive. Park it where I was told, walk away, don't ask questions. He said I would be paid 1,000 pesos. In one afternoon. 1,000 pesos. The journalist did the calculation. The Sicario named a figure that, even accounting for exchange rates and inflation, represented approximately 3 times what the Sicario's father earned in a full week of work. For an afternoon of driving. The Sicario looked at the journalist steadily as he said this, and the journalist nodded, because he understood what that number meant to a 16-year-old boy in that city at that time. It did not mean corruption. It did not mean crime. It meant shoes that fit. It meant his mother's face when he put something on the table she did not have to calculate. It meant the first tiny taste of the thing that would eventually consume him entirely. I drove the car, the Sicario said simply. I did not look in the trunk. He paused. He picked up the black marker and drew a line on the legal pad, a straight horizontal line with a small dot in the middle. He tapped the dot. That dot, he said, is the exact moment. The one decision. Every person who ends up where I ended up can show you that dot on their line. They may not know it when they are making the decision. Usually they do not. But later, if they are honest, if they are willing to look, they can find it. That is mine. The car. The afternoon. The 1,000 pesos. He drove 6 more cars over the next 3 months. Each time the pay was the same or slightly better. Each time the instructions were the same. Drive. Park. Walk away. Don't look. Don't ask. The Sicario was not a fool. He knew what he was carrying. The smell of the city told him what he was carrying, the particular combination of chemical and fear that clung to those cars the way smoke clings to fabric. He knew. He drove anyway. By the time he turned 17, he was not just driving cars. He was driving people. Quiet men who sat in the back seat and watched the streets go by with the flat, alert eyes of animals tracking movement. He did not speak to them. They did not speak to him. He drove them where he was told, and then he drove home and sat at the dinner table with his family and passed the beans and said nothing. "Did your family know?" the journalist asked. The Sicario considered the question with the care he gave to all questions that touched on his family. There was something in him, some compartment he had built and sealed and never fully opened, that contained them. The journalist could see the edges of it in the way the man's body shifted when certain subjects came near. "My mother knew something had changed," he said at last. "Mothers always know. They do not always want to know what they know. She saw the money. She did not ask where it came from. I think she was afraid of the answer." He paused. I did not blame her for that. I was afraid of the answer too, and I already knew it. At 18, a recruiter came for him properly. Not the boy from school. Someone older. Someone with authority. Someone who wore the uniform of the Chihuahua State Police and drove a truck with government plates and sat down across from the Sicario with the manner of a man who is offering something he knows will be accepted. Because in the world the Sicario was already moving through, this was not an offer you turned down. It was not phrased as a command either. It was phrased the way all the most dangerous invitations are phrased. As an opportunity, as recognition, as the acknowledgement that someone important had noticed you and found you worthy. "He told me I had a skill," the Sicario said. "He told me I was good at being invisible, at not drawing attention, at moving through spaces without leaving a mark. He said that was rare. He said the organization valued it." He paused. He said the police academy was being paid for. My training, my uniform, my salary during training. All paid. I just had to say yes. The journalist asked what organization the recruiter was referring to. The Sicario looked at him for a long moment. "Both," he said. He was police and cartel. There was no difference. That was the first real lesson. In Juarez, in those years, the difference between the police and the cartel was a uniform. Nothing else. The same men, the same money, the same orders, just different shirts. He said this without bitterness, without anger, with the tone of a man describing a geographical feature, a mountain range, a river delta, something that simply existed and shaped the landscape around it and could not be meaningfully argued with. The journalist would hear that tone many times in the hours that followed. It was, he eventually decided, the tone of a man who had spent 20 years inside a machine and had made his peace with the fact that the machine was real, not justified, real. The Sicario joined the police academy at 18. He was given a uniform, a badge, a gun, a salary, and an education that was unlike any curriculum you would find in a conventional institution. He learned firearms. He learned surveillance. He learned how to read license plates from memory, how to track a vehicle through urban traffic without being spotted, how to conduct interviews that were not interviews at all but extractions, how to recognize fear in a person's body before it reached their face. He was a diligent student. He graduated near the top of his class. He also, during that same period, attended a different kind of class. These ones were held not in the academy, but in houses on the outskirts of the city, rooms without windows or with the windows covered, rooms where men who did not give their names explained the real structure of power in Chihuahua. Who answered to whom? Who was protected? Who was not? What the codes meant, the radio codes, the phone codes, the street codes that had been developed over years of practice into a language as complete and functional as any other, a language spoken only by those inside the machine and utterly opaque to those outside it. He learned, in those rooms, that the radio code for a killing order was 39. When a superior said 39 over the radio, the action required was not paperwork. It was not an arrest. It was not a conversation. It was a body in the ground. He heard that code for the first time in a room with covered windows and men without names, and he stored it away in the part of himself that was still capable of being disturbed by things, the part that would shrink and shrink and shrink over the years until it was very small, though never entirely gone. "Were you afraid?" the journalist asked. When you first understood what you were actually being trained for? The Sicario picked up the marker again. He held it without drawing anything. He looked at the legal pad. He looked up. I was 20 years old, he said. I was wearing a uniform. I had money in my pocket. I had a gun on my hip. Every person I walked past on the street stepped aside for me. Every business owner I walked into became careful. He put the marker down. Fear is for people with nothing. I had everything. That is the truth that no one wants to hear. In the beginning, it does not feel like fear. It feels like power. And power is the most addictive thing in the world. The journalist had been in that room for nearly 2 hours when the Sicario said something that made him put down his pen and stare at the wall for a moment. They had been talking about the early days, about the structure of the world the Sicario had been absorbed into, about the dual life he was leading, the policeman by day, the cartel operative by night, though those categories had never been truly separate and would soon stop being separate even in name. The journalist had asked about the other men around him, the colleagues, the fellow recruits, the ones who had gone through the same process and arrived at the same place. Were they like you? He asked. Did they seem like ordinary people? The Sicario almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile the journalist saw in that room all afternoon. All of them, he said. Every single one. That is what they want you to think is impossible. That ordinary people do these things. That it must be monsters. Because if it is monsters, you can sleep at night. You can tell yourself that you would recognize a monster. You can tell yourself that you are safe. He leaned forward slightly. But if it is ordinary people, trained carefully, placed inside a system that makes the extraordinary ordinary, then the world is more frightening than you are willing to admit. And most people are not willing to admit that. The journalist was willing. That was why he was there. He wrote down what the Sicario said, and then he asked the question he had been building toward for the entire conversation. The question that both of them knew was coming. The question that everything else had been circling around like water circling a drain. Tell me about the first time you killed someone. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the parking lot, a truck started and then drove away. The vending machine hummed. The curtains moved slightly in the air from the conditioning unit. The Sicario looked at the journalist with those flat, measuring eyes for a long moment, and then he nodded once, as if granting permission for a territory to be entered. I was 22, he said. I had been working the system for 4 years by then, moving between the police side and the cartel side the way you move between rooms in a house. I knew the system. I understood the language. I understood the hierarchy. And they had decided that I was ready. He did not begin the story immediately. He constructed it carefully, the way a mason sets stones, one at a time, checking the level before moving to the next. The journalist, watching him, understood that this was not performance. The Sicario was not dramatizing his past. He was, in some sense, revisiting a room in his own memory, walking through it carefully, making sure he had the dimensions right. He was a precise man. Even in this, precision mattered to him. It happened in a car. Not a government car, not a marked vehicle, but a civilian sedan borrowed for the purpose, the kind of car that nobody notices on any street in any city in the world. There were 3 of them inside. The Sicario in the back seat. Another man beside him, older, a mentor of sorts, someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer even registered in his body when it happened. No elevated pulse, no tensed muscle, nothing. And in the front passenger seat, a man who did not know that this drive would be his last. He was not a good person, the Sicario said. I want to be accurate about that. He had done things. I knew what he had done. He had stolen from people he was not supposed to steal from. He had talked to people he was not supposed to talk to. In our world, those are the 2 things that get you killed. Stealing from the wrong people. Talking to the wrong people. He had done both. The journalist asked how the order had come. Over the radio, the Sicario said. He paused. 39. They drove for approximately 20 minutes. The Sicario did not tell the journalist exactly where, just that it was outside the city, away from the built-up areas, somewhere the desert absorbed things without comment. The man in the front seat talked for part of the drive. He made conversation about nothing, the football scores, the weather, the price of a car he was thinking of buying. He was nervous, the Sicario said, but he was not certain, not yet, not fully. People in that world lived with a baseline level of fear all the time. They had learned to metabolize it, to keep functioning under its pressure the way an organism adapts to altitude. The nervousness was normal. The conversation was normal. Nothing in the car, on that road, in that ordinary evening, announced itself as the end of the world. The Minter, the Sicario said, choosing his words with care, gave the signal. A very small thing. The way he shifted his weight. That was all. That was the language. I had been taught the language. The journalist did not ask for the precise details of what happened next. The Sicario told him anyway, briefly, technically, in the way a mechanic describes a repair. There was no emotional charge in the telling. No pride. No guilt. That was what the journalist found most difficult to absorb. Not the act itself, which was terrible and final, but the complete absence of effect around it. As though he were describing something he had done to a machine, not a man. And after, the journalist managed. After, the Sicario said, we drove back. The Minter said I had done well. He said I was calm. He said calm was the most important thing. That the ones who are not calm are the ones who make mistakes, and mistakes get everyone killed. He picked up the marker. He drew a small circle on the pad. We went to a house. There was food. There was money. There were bottles of tequila. There were women who had been sent there to celebrate with us. Everyone around me was eating and drinking and laughing. And I sat in a corner, and I felt something that I did not have a word for at the time. What was it? The journalist asked. The Sicario thought for a long moment. Later I understood it was the last time I felt what a normal person would call guilt, he said. Not guilt the way a priest would define it. Something more physical. A sensation in the chest. Like a door closing. Like something fitting into a lock. I felt it that night, very clearly one time. And then it was done, and I never felt it exactly that way again. The journalist thought about that. He thought about it the way you think about something that does not fully fit into the categories you have available, that sits outside the maps you carry. He asked the next question carefully. Did the reward help? The money, the tequila, the celebration? The Sicario shook his head. That is what people think. That the reward converts the killing into a transaction. A sale. You do this, you get that. But it is not so simple. The reward is not what changes you. What changes you is the discovery that you survived. That you did the thing, and the world kept turning, and the sun came up, and you were still breathing, and no one who looked at you on the street the next morning could see it on your face. That invisibility, he said, and there was the first genuine intensity the journalist had heard in his voice. That is the drug. Not the money. The invisibility. He was right, the journalist thought. Of course he was right. The money was the transaction. But the discovery that you could carry something that monstrous and still walk through the ordinary world unremarked, undetected, invisible, that was the thing that rewired the architecture of a person's sense of self. Once you knew that, you could not unknow it. The wall between the life you were living and the life everyone around you assumed you were living was paper thin, and only you could see that, and the power of that knowledge was real and immediate and utterly intoxicating. Over the next several months, it happened again and again. The Sicario did not give the journalist an exact count for that period. He said the count stopped being meaningful fairly quickly. You count until you stop counting, he said. Most people stop counting earlier than they expect. Each instance arrived with the same mechanics as the first. The coded order, the car, the somewhere outside the city, the return, the continuation of ordinary life. He grew faster and more practiced. The Minter stopped coming. The Sicario was operating on his own authority now, which meant he had been absorbed fully into the structure of something that had no clear edge and no visible ceiling. The journalist asked about his life during that period. What did it look like from the outside? From the outside, the Sicario said, I was a police officer. I had a salary, official. I wore a uniform several days a week. I stopped drivers. I filed reports. I attended briefings. I had a small apartment, and later a better one. I bought a truck. I had a girlfriend who believed I was a policeman having trouble sleeping. He paused. The trouble sleeping was real. Even then, even in those early years when the system was still new enough to carry some charge, some residual electricity of wrongness, the nights were not peaceful. Not because of guilt. The Sicario was clear about that distinction, not because of moral distress in any recognizable form, but because the machine in which he now lived never fully switched off. There was always a call that might come, always a number that might appear, always a calculation being made somewhere about who was useful and who had become a liability. He was police. He was cartel. He was neither. He was both. He existed in the seam between two worlds that most people believed were opposite and that were, in fact, the same cloth cut in different directions. He described the structure of the organization during that period with the detached clarity of someone explaining corporate logistics. It was, he said, more sophisticated than the films ever showed. There were no dramatic meetings with kingpins, no long tables and fortified rooms, no speeches about loyalty and honor. What there was, instead, was a system built for invisibility. Small cells, each cell knowing only what it needed to know to function. No one above communicated downward beyond the next level. No one below communicated upward beyond their immediate contact. It was, he said, precisely the structure of an intelligence agency. Which made sense, because that is what it was. An intelligence agency in the service of an empire built on the movement of powder and the management of death, an empire as real and as powerful and as carefully administered as any nation-state, with its own laws and its own economy and its own foreign policy and its own military, all of it running parallel to the official world, all of it invisible to everyone who was not inside it. We knew everything, the Sicario said. We knew every police operation before it happened. We knew every informant. We knew every journalist who was getting too close. We knew every politician who was negotiating. We knew when the Americans were watching and from where. Everything. Because we were inside the institutions that had that information. We were the institutions. He drew on the legal pad then. A series of circles inside circles, connected by lines. He labeled none of them. He just looked at the diagram, and then turned it toward the journalist. This is how it works, he said. You cannot fight something you cannot see. You cannot see something you are already inside of. That is why it survives. Not because it is powerful, because it is everywhere. If you are still with me, I need you to do something right now. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. I want to know. Because this story is far from over, and what comes next is even darker. The journalist had been prepared to be disturbed. He had not been prepared to be educated. That was the distinction he would later struggle to articulate to the colleagues and editors and loved ones who asked him what it had been like to sit across from this man for all those hours in that room near the border. He had expected horror. He had found horror. But underneath it, or perhaps woven through it, he had found something he had not expected at all, which was clarity. The Sicario was the clearest thinker he had ever interviewed. Not in spite of what he was. Because of it. 20 years inside a machine that punished confusion and rewarded precision had produced a man whose understanding of how power actually functioned was, in its terrible way, almost flawless. The journalist asked him about the phrase he had used. The philosopher of violence. He had not actually used those words, but the journalist had been hearing them in his head since the conversation began. Do you think what you did was wrong? He asked. The Sicario considered the question carefully. He did not dismiss it. He did not deflect it with the kind of practiced non-answer that certain types of dangerous men learn to deploy. He sat with it for a moment, the way a person sits with a heavy object before deciding whether they have the strength to carry it. Wrong is a word for people who have access to a moral framework that functions, he said at last. When the police are the cartel, and the cartel is the government, and the government is the police, what does wrong mean? You are asking me to use a compass in a room where north does not exist. He looked at the journalist steadily. I am not saying I am innocent. I am saying that innocence requires a world in which innocence is possible. That world did not exist in Juarez. Maybe it exists somewhere. It did not exist there. It was not an argument the journalist could simply reject. He knew enough of the documented history of Chihuahua in those years to understand that the Sicario was not constructing a fantasy to protect himself. The corruption was documented, investigated, prosecuted, in the rare cases where prosecution was even possible. Human rights organizations had published reports. Journalists had died publishing reports. The percentage of law enforcement officers in the region who had active ties to cartel organizations during the peak years of violence had been estimated, conservatively, at somewhere between 70 and 85%. The Sicario had told him 85. He had said it the way a person quotes a statistic they personally verified. When I put on my uniform, the Sicario said, and I drove through the city in a marked vehicle, every other officer I passed knew what I was. Every commander above me knew what I was. Every officer below me knew what I was. We all knew. Everyone was the same. The ones who were not, he paused, did not last long. He meant that as information, not as a threat, not as justification. The journalist understood the difference because by now he had begun to understand something about the way this man communicated. He was not trying to convince. He was trying to be accurate. Accuracy was the value he most consistently displayed, about his own crimes as much as about the system that enabled them. He did not round down the numbers. He did not soften the language around the things he had done. He described them with a precision that was more disturbing, in its way, than any dramatization could have been, because precision implies understanding, and understanding implies choice, and the Sicario clearly understood, had always understood, which meant that the 20 years of choices had not been made in ignorance. There was, however, a category of question that the Sicario answered with something close to real emotion, and that category was this: what happened to the people who tried to leave? There was a woman, he said. This was the first story he told that was not about himself, and the journalist noted the shift immediately. She was the girlfriend of one of the senior men. Not a wife. The wife was separate. A girlfriend. She was 23 years old. She was not stupid. She understood the world she was in. She did not ask questions. She did not make demands. She was, by every measure I was aware of, exactly what such a woman needed to be in that situation, which was invisible and silent. He paused. He picked up the marker and put it down again. She talked to someone, he said. Not to the authorities. Not to a journalist. She talked to her cousin, who was from outside that world. She was lonely, and she was frightened, and she had made the mistake that people make in that situation. She forgot that the walls are always listening. That there is no safe conversation. That the concept of privacy had been abolished in the world we inhabited as completely as if it had never existed. The journalist waited. By the following afternoon, the Sicario said, she was gone. He said nothing more about what gone meant in this context. He did not need to. The journalist had spent enough time on the border to understand the grammar of that word. And the senior man? The journalist asked. He was told, the Sicario said. He said nothing. He looked at the journalist. What could he say? The rules were the rules. They applied equally. They did not bend for relationships. They did not bend for anything. That was the only reason they functioned. A rule that bends stops being a rule. It becomes a suggestion. And in our world, suggestions were not taken seriously. This was the philosophy of violence that the Sicario had developed over his years inside the machine. And it was, the journalist had to admit, internally consistent. Not moral. Not defensible by any ethical framework the journalist knew how to use. But consistent. It operated on a logic. The logic was brutal and inhuman. But it was logic, and the journalist, sitting in that room, was beginning to understand something that he found profoundly unsettling, which was that the brutality of the cartel world was not chaos. It was not disorder. It was not the absence of rules. It was the presence of a different set of rules, rules as strict and as elaborately enforced as any in the legitimate world, perhaps more so, because the consequences of breaking them were never theoretical. Good killers, the Sicario said, are craftsmen. They take pride in their work. Not the way you take pride in something creative, in making something. The pride of the surgeon. The pilot. The person who does a technical thing and does it correctly and does not allow variables that could be controlled to go uncontrolled. A bad hit is one where something goes wrong that should not have gone wrong. Where the target is not alone when they should have been alone. Where there is a witness who did not have to be a witness. Where the body is found before it should have been found. Those are failures. A craftsman does not fail. The journalist asked how long it took to reach that level. That level of craft. The Sicario looked at him with those flat eyes and said, less time than you want me to say. He was describing, the journalist began to understand, a process of desensitization that was not unique to this world, that had analogs in military training, in the training of surgeons, in the training of anyone who must perform at high levels under conditions of extreme stress and exposure to human damage. The military had spent decades studying how soldiers became capable of combat, the psychological architecture required to overcome the most basic of all human instincts, the instinct to preserve life, your own and others. The cartel had, without the research papers or the academic framework, figured out the same thing empirically, through generations of practice, through the simple and terrible trial and error of deploying people in conditions of extreme violence, and observing what made them effective and what made them break. What made them effective, the Sicario explained, was not cruelty. The truly cruel men, the ones who took pleasure in pain for its own sake, were actually a liability. They were unpredictable. They became excessive at moments when excess created risk. They could not be precisely controlled. The ideal operator was not a sadist. The ideal operator was a professional, a person who felt nothing in particular about what they were doing and therefore did it with a craftsman's precision. The Sicario was describing his own ideal self, the self he had been trained and shaped and refined into over 20 years. And listening to him describe it, the journalist felt something complicated, not admiration, never that, but something in the register of recognition. This man was not crazy. That was the problem. He was not a monster in the sense the journalist had hoped for when he walked through that door. He was a professional in a trade whose product was human suffering, but a professional nonetheless. They had been in the room for 3 hours when the journalist needed water, and the Sicario produced a bottle from a bag he had brought and handed it across the table without comment. The journalist accepted it and drank, and then asked if they could talk about the city itself, about Juarez as he had experienced it during those years. The Sicario nodded. He thought for a moment. There are cities that are alive, he said. You can feel the energy of them, the movement, the ambition, the pleasure. Even cities with great poverty have that energy. Juarez, in those years, was a cemetery. Not because everyone was dead, though many were, but because the living were performing life rather than living it. They went through the routines. They got up. They went to work. They came home. They closed their doors. They did not see what they were not supposed to see. They did not say what they were not supposed to say. And every morning there were more bodies, and the bodies were explained in the newspapers with codes, with euphemisms, with language that turned human beings into crime statistics. And everyone understood the code, and everyone continued performing life, because the alternative was to stop performing it. And in Juarez, stopping was not a metaphor. He said something then that the journalist would later identify as the most important thing he heard in that room. He said, "The people who will never understand Juarez are the people who think the violence was foreign to the city, imported, something done to the city from outside. But it was not. It grew there, from the ground, from the gap between what people were promised and what they were given, from the architecture of a place where everything that mattered was controlled by people who did not live there. The cartels were Juarez. They were the city expressing itself in the only language it had been given the tools to speak. That is the tragedy, not just the dead. The tragedy is that it made sense. There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a room when a person is about to say something they have never said out loud. The journalist recognized it because he had been a journalist long enough to have sat in many rooms where secrets were preparing to cross the threshold from thought to word. It is not dramatic, that silence. It is not the silence of a held breath or a dramatic pause. It is quieter than that, the silence of a decision being made somewhere deep inside a person, the last moment of privacy before exposure. The Sicario went quiet in exactly that way, and the journalist sat very still and waited. "I need you to understand something about the kidnapping operation," the Sicario said. "Because people think they understand it from the news, from the films, from the stories they hear, and they do not. The kidnapping operation was not criminal in the way that word implies. Random, desperate, chaotic. It was a business. It was run the way a business is run, with departments, with logistics, with customer service, if you want to call it that, because the ransom negotiation is a kind of customer service in the most obscene possible sense. Every step was planned. Every step had a purpose. Every step was executable by trained people following tested procedures." He picked up the marker and began to draw on the legal pad. Not diagrams this time, but a kind of flowchart. Boxes and arrows. Input and output. The language of process management applied to the abduction of human beings. "It begins with selection," he said, drawing an arrow. "Not random selection. The organization identifies targets carefully. A businessman whose financial situation is well understood. A family with wealth that has been assessed and verified. The research is extensive. You know how much money this person can access. You know their daily patterns. You know their family structure. You know who they will call when you take them. You know how those people will behave under pressure. You know everything before you move." He drew another box. Another arrow. "Then comes the surveillance phase. This lasts days or weeks, depending on the target. Multiple people are watching. Some of them know they are part of the operation. Some of them do not know. They are informants who think they are providing information for other reasons. The target's movements are mapped. Their patterns are cataloged. The moment of maximum vulnerability is identified, the point in their routine where they are most isolated, where intervention is most likely to go unnoticed, where the distance from help is greatest. The journalist was writing quickly. He noted that the Sicario used the word intervention and not the word abduction. He noted the clinical language. He noted that nowhere in this explanation did the Sicario use a word that acknowledged the human being at the center of the operation. The actual taking, the Sicario continued, drawing a third box, is usually very fast. 2 to 4 minutes from first contact to secured. The team is trained. They have rehearsed the specific scenario. They know their assignments. There is one who controls the target. One who controls the environment, meaning the people nearby, the witnesses. One who controls the vehicle. And one who is above the scene, observing, managing, watching for variables. He tapped the flowchart. For people, minimum. Often 6. For a high-value target, more. He paused. He seemed to be deciding how much further to go. The police vehicles, the journalist said carefully. It was less a question than an acknowledgement of what he had been told before. Of course, the Sicario said. Why would you use a criminal's car when you can use a police car? A police car stops traffic. It does not create witnesses. It creates deference. When people see a police vehicle, they step aside. They look away. They cooperate. They assume that whatever is happening is authorized. Because it is authorized. Just not by the institution that authorized the vehicle. He set down the marker. We drove kidnapping victims across the city in marked police vehicles. Through checkpoints. Past other police units. With the lights on. Sometimes, if we needed people to move. He looked at the journalist. This is not a detail from a film. This is the operational reality. The journalist asked about the victims. What happened to them after the vehicle? The Sicario's face did something complicated. Not guilt, or not exactly. Something more like the expression of a doctor discussing a procedure that had outcomes they preferred not to examine too closely. There are houses, he said. Not houses in the way you are imagining. Not places that look unusual. Ordinary houses in ordinary neighborhoods. The kind that nobody looks at twice. Inside, there are rooms that have been prepared. Soundproofed. Bolted. Dark. The kind of dark where you cannot tell if it is day or night. And that disorientation is intentional. He looked at his hands for a moment. When you cannot tell if it is day or night, you cannot tell how long you have been there. And when you cannot tell how long you have been there, you cannot maintain your sense of reality. Your sense of who you are. You become dependent on whatever information is given to you. Even wrong information. Especially wrong information. He was describing, the journalist realized, a sophisticated psychological methodology. Sensory deprivation. Sleep disruption. Temporal dislocation. These were not improvised cruelties. They were techniques documented in the academic literature on coercive interrogation. Techniques studied and applied by state intelligence agencies. Applied here to civilians, to business people and their families, to people who had done nothing except possess money. The blindfold is important, the Sicario said. Not just so they cannot see where they are. So they cannot look at the people around them. So they cannot establish a human connection with their captors. A person who sees your face becomes real to you. A person you cannot see remains an object. The blindfold works on both sides. It keeps the captor safe psychologically as much as physically. When you cannot see their face, they cannot see yours. And so neither of you is fully real to the other. And that makes everything that follows possible. He paused. He looked at the journalist directly, holding his gaze in the way that had become characteristic of this conversation, the direct, steady, measuring look that never seemed to need anything, never seemed to want anything, never performed itself. The families, the journalist said. It came out smaller than he intended. The families, the Sicario said, are the mechanism. He said it without apology, without effect, as though saying it. The target is not the business. The target is the access to the family. The family is where the money is. The family is what you squeeze. He chose that word deliberately. The journalist felt certain of it. Not to shock, because it was accurate. The contact is made within 24 hours. Sometimes earlier. The voice on the phone is calm. Professional. This is important. Panic on the caller's side means nothing happens efficiently. Calm means business. Calm means this is real and it is being managed. The family hears a calm voice and they understand that this is an organization and not a random crime, and that organizations have procedures that can be navigated. He paused. That understanding is itself a form of control. The journalist asked about the amounts. Whatever they have, the Sicario said simply. That is what they pay. The research is done in advance. We know the ceiling. We always open above the ceiling, because negotiation is expected and the distance between the opening number and the settled number matters for the family psychology. They need to feel they won something, that their negotiation had an effect, that they protected their loved one by being smart, by not panicking, by doing what was asked. We gave them that. We allowed the number to come down by 10, 15%. And then they paid what we had decided at the beginning they were going to pay, and they believed they had saved 10% of their person's life. He stopped. He looked at the legal pad. He drew a line through one of the boxes in his flowchart. He said, very quietly, most of them did not come home. The journalist absorbed that slowly. Even after payment? He asked. Payment was not the variable, the Sicario said. Payment was never the variable. The variable was exposure. Whether the family had followed instructions precisely enough. Whether there had been contact with authorities. Whether there had been visible surveillance in the area. Whether the target had seen faces. Whether the target had heard names. Whether the risk calculation, at the end, favored release. He was quiet for a moment. The risk calculation almost never favored release. The journalist sat with that. He sat with the enormity of it. He thought about families. Mothers. He thought about what it means to follow every instruction and pay everything you have, and then wait, and wait, and wait. He thought about the moment when waiting becomes something else. He said nothing for a long time. You want to ask me something? The Sicario said. I want to ask you, the journalist said carefully, whether you thought about them. The families. While it was happening, the Sicario looked at him for a long time. He was, the journalist sensed, measuring something. Measuring whether this was a trap or a real question. Whether the journalist wanted an answer he could condemn or an answer that was true. In the beginning, the Sicario said at last, there was a voice. Very small. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just there. Like a radio in another room that you are not listening to, but that you can hear if the house is quiet enough. It said things I did not want to hear. About the people in those rooms. About what they were feeling. About their families. He looked at his hands again. I learned to make the house louder. It is not difficult, once you know how. You drink more. You work more. You fill the hours between operations with things that make noise. After a while, the radio in the other room is not there anymore. You do not notice when it stops. You only notice the quiet. Later, when everything else has stopped too. He said this, and then he picked up his water and drank. He put it down carefully, precisely, in exactly the same spot on the table it had come from. And the journalist, watching him, thought about that radio in the other room. About the house getting louder. About the moment when the quiet comes. The journalist had brought a spare recorder. In this world, you brought a spare of everything you could not afford to lose. The first recorder was clipped to the front of his jacket. The second was in his shirt pocket. Both were running. Both were picking up the sound of the air conditioning and the distant traffic and the Sicario's voice, which never rose and never fell and maintained that extraordinary flat calm throughout, with only the rarest moments of intensity breaking through, like stones surfacing at low tide, barely visible, but absolutely real. They were past the 4-hour mark now. The journalist's back ached. The Sicario seemed not to have moved at all, seemed not to register the passage of time in his body in any way that the journalist could detect. He sat across the table with the same posture he had adopted at the beginning, and he answered each question with the same deliberate care, the same absence of performance. The journalist had interviewed heads of state, disaster survivors, serial killers' family members, trauma surgeons, political prisoners. He had never sat across from anyone who made him feel, as this man did, that he was in the presence of something outside the ordinary taxonomy of human experience. Not because the Sicario was inhuman, but because he was so entirely, recognizably human, and that was what made it impossible. The journalist asked about the structure of the hit operation, not the kidnappings, the contracted killings. The Sicario worked proper. The Sicario set down the marker. He had been using it throughout the conversation to punctuate his thinking, picking it up and setting it down, drawing occasional diagrams, though most of those diagrams he covered with his hand after completing them, as though the act of drawing had been for his own reference rather than for the record. "You need 3 things for a precision operation," he said. "Eyes, mind, hands. Those are the 3 components. They are never the same person. The eyes are the surveillance team. They watch the target. They learn the target's patterns. They feed information upward. They never touch the target. They never make contact. They observe. The mind is the planner. He receives the information from the eyes, and he designs the operation. He decides the moment, the location, the approach, the exit, the contingencies. Every variable that can be anticipated is anticipated. Every response to every variable is planned. The mind does not execute. He is never there when it happens." He paused. "And the hands execute. The hands are the last link. They receive a plan they did not design. They are given the intelligence they did not gather. Their job is execution. Pure execution. Without variation. Without improvisation, if at all possible." The journalist asked which role he had played. "All 3, the Sicario said. "In the beginning, hands only. Later mind. Later still, both, simultaneously, which is when it becomes most dangerous." He said it without pride, as an operational assessment. "Dangerous for who?" the journalist asked. "For the organization," the Sicario said. "One person who knows too much is a vulnerability. One person who has played all 3 roles in multiple operations, who knows the faces of the planners and the identities of the surveillance teams and the methods of the execution. That person is a significant vulnerability. The system does not prefer significant vulnerabilities. It prefers simple ones. Simple vulnerabilities can be managed." He looked at the journalist steadily. "Eventually, I became someone who knew too much. That is relevant to the later part of the story." The journalist filed that away. He asked about the target selection for the hit operations. "Who decided? How it was communicated?" "The order comes from above," the Sicario said. "Always. No freelancing. No initiative. You do not decide who dies. You are told who dies, and you execute the decision. The hierarchy above you has made the decision for reasons that are usually not explained and that you do not ask about. This is not because asking would get you killed, though it might. It is because asking is philosophically incoherent. You are not a member of a committee. You are a tool. A tool does not ask about the policy. It performs the function. The policy exists at a level you have no access to." He said something then that the journalist found himself returning to over and over in the weeks after the interview. He said, "The greatest lie about organized crime is the idea that the people inside it are driven by ideology, by evil for its own sake, by some kind of perverse loyalty to darkness. Most people inside it are simply inside a system that functions like every other system they could name, except that the product is different. It has HR. It has finance. It has operations and logistics and quality control. It has promotion and demotion. It has internal politics. It has loyalty and betrayal and ambition and envy. It is a corporation. A corporation with a different product and different compliance mechanisms. The people inside it are not monsters. They are employees." He picked up the marker. He wrote one word on the legal pad in large block letters. He did not show it to the journalist. He looked at it for a moment, then turned it face down. The journalist asked about the specific mechanics of a planned hit. The Sicario described it in detail that was precise and technical and almost, in its precision, beautiful in the horrible way that certain terrible things can be beautiful when they are done with absolute mastery. The surveillance phase, the selection of position, the timing calculated around the target's established patterns, the approach route and the exit route, always separate, always pre-walked, always timed. The contingency plans for the scenarios most likely to produce complications, traffic, unexpected people, the target changing the routine at the last moment. The communication protocols between the team members, all coded, none of them speaking plainly even to each other at any point in the operation. The cleanup, the dispersal, the 3-hour rule that required all team members to be out of the relevant district before the body was found. And the one thing you never do, the Sicario said, is the same thing twice. Same route twice. Same team twice. Same method twice. Repetition is signature. Signature is risk. Risk is how you end up in a room like this one. He gestured at the walls, and the journalist understood he was not referring to the motel room. He was referring to all the rooms he had ever been in that resembled this one. The rooms where violence was planned and discussed and executed and analyzed. Every detail that connects two events can eventually be followed backward to the people behind the events. The system survives because it never repeats. It is always changing. The variables are always reshuffled. No two operations look the same from the outside. The journalist asked about the border, about the operations that crossed from Mexico into the United States. He knew this was a delicate topic. He asked carefully. The Sicario did not hesitate. The border, he said, is a political feature. It exists on maps. It exists in the American imagination. It exists in political speeches. On the ground, it is a line that can be crossed. The organization had been crossing it for longer than the journalist corps had been covering it. The penetration of American institutions, law enforcement, customs, transportation, financial, is documented. I will not name names or agencies. But the idea that the border represents a genuine operational obstacle is something that makes American policymakers feel safer without making anyone actually safer. He was careful here. He spoke with the care of a man who understood that certain things, said too precisely, could reduce his remaining life expectancy to something measurable in hours rather than years. But within those parameters, he confirmed what investigators and journalists had been documenting for years, that the cartel's ability to operate across the southern border of the United States was not a failure of enforcement. It was the product of a systematic and long-term cultivation of relationships within the enforcement apparatus itself. We had people everywhere, he said. Not everywhere in the sense of a conspiracy theory. Everywhere in the sense of a business strategy. You identify the points of control. You identify the people at those points. You assess which of those people are accessible. You make them accessible to money, or to fear, or to both. And then you manage those relationships the way you manage any business relationship. With consistency. With delivery on promises. With consequences for failure. He paused. The Americans are not stupid. The people in those positions are not stupid. But everyone has a price. And the organization had the budget. The journalist sat with that for a moment. He thought about the people he knew in customs and immigration and law enforcement. He thought about the salaries those people earned. He thought about the gap between those salaries and what the Sicario was describing. He thought about the pressure of living on that border, in that economy, with those neighbors, with that daily exposure to money and power that dwarfed anything the legitimate world could offer. He did not feel comfortable with the thoughts he was having. He had them anyway. I need to ask you something, the journalist said. He paused. Why are you telling me all of this? The Sicario looked at him for a long time. For the first time since the conversation began, the journalist could not read what was happening behind those flat eyes. He waited. The Sicario picked up the marker. He did not draw anything. He turned it end over end once, twice, then set it precisely parallel to the edge of the legal pad. Because, he said at last, I am still alive, and I do not entirely know why, and it seems like that should mean something. He looked at the journalist. Whether it does or not, I cannot say, but the story exists whether or not someone tells it. And if someone is going to tell it, it should be told correctly, without the parts that make it comfortable, without the parts that let people sleep more easily than they should. He looked at the journalist steadily. You should not sleep easily after this, he said. That is the point. There was a code the Sicario said almost every time he wanted to circle back to something. He would say, very quietly, I need to be accurate about this. And then he would revise or expand what he had said before, not to soften it, but to sharpen it. To remove the imprecision that crept in when speaking about things you have lived so deeply that language starts to feel like the wrong tool. The journalist began to hear that phrase as a signal. When the Sicario said he needed to be accurate, something important was coming. Something he had been holding a certain distance from that he was now ready to let come closer. He said it now. The journalist straightened. I need to be accurate about the torture, the Sicario said. He let that sit for a moment. The journalist did not speak. The word torture carries an image, the Sicario continued. Something chaotic, angry, the product of hatred or sadism or the loss of control. That is the popular image. It is almost entirely wrong, at least for the kind of operation I was part of. What we practiced was systematic. It was designed to produce specific outcomes. It was calibrated. You can calibrate suffering the way you calibrate any instrument. You learn the thresholds. You learn what moves a person from one psychological state to another, from resistance to compliance, from compliance to despair, from despair to the specific kind of complete surrender that makes a person do exactly what you need them to do without requiring further persuasion. That knowledge is not mystical. It is technical, and the organization had spent years developing it. He was describing, the journalist would later research and confirm, a methodology that had documented parallels in state-sponsored interrogation programs that had been investigated and condemned by international human rights bodies. The cartel had not invented these techniques. No one had invented them, really. They were, in their terrible way, the product of an ancient human understanding that the body and the mind are connected, that the geography of suffering is navigable, that a person can be led from one place to another inside themselves by someone who knows the route. The objective, the Sicario said, is never punishment. People think torture is punishment. It is not. Punishment has no operational use. Punishment is emotional. Emotional things are inefficient. The objective is information, or it is compliance, or it is a message to others. Those are three different objectives, and they require three different approaches. A person who is being broken for information needs to remain coherent enough to provide it. A person who is being broken for compliance needs to remain capable enough to execute what they are being complied toward. A person whose treatment is meant as a message needs to be in a condition that communicates the message when they are found, or when photographs are taken. He paused. He looked at the journalist. You need to understand that these are not the thoughts of a monster. They are the thoughts of a person inside a system that defined these as professional considerations. The journalist asked about the houses where this happened. The safe houses, the death houses, as they were sometimes called. They are not dramatic, the Sicario said. That is what I want you to understand. The drama is in the mind of the person inside. For the people running the house, it is a workplace. They arrive. They do their work. They go home. The house itself is ordinary. A room with a drain in the floor. A chair. Items that are not interesting out of context. It is the context that creates the horror. Remove the context and you have a room. Add the context and you have what it is. He looked at the journalist carefully. You want to know if I personally, he said, and let the sentence hang. Yes, the journalist said. Yes, the Sicario said. He said it without anything attached to it. No qualifier. No apology. No elaboration beyond what was necessary. I was in those rooms. I did those things. I was good at it, in the professional sense I described. I did not enjoy it in the sense of pleasure. I experienced it in the sense of completion, a task being executed, the sensation of a thing being done correctly. He paused. If that makes me a monster, I understand. But I want you to understand what that says about the definition of monster. It says that monstrousness is a function of context. That under different conditions, in a different world, the qualities that made me effective in those rooms might have made me a surgeon, a detective, a soldier following orders that someone in a position of authority had decided were legitimate. He looked at the journalist. I am not absolving myself. I am asking you to look at the category. The journalist was looking at the category. He was not comfortable in it. But he was looking. He asked about the victims. Not as a category. Specifically, were there individuals he remembered? People who stood out from the operational abstraction that the Sicario had been describing. Something shifted in the room. It was subtle. The temperature did not change. The light did not change. The Sicario's posture did not change. But something changed, the way the quality of the air changes when you are at altitude and have not noticed until this moment. The journalist felt it and held still. There was a man, the Sicario said. His voice remained flat, middle-aged. He had a business that imported parts. Auto parts. He was a legitimate person. He had a wife and 3 daughters. He had a dog. I know about the dog because the surveillance report was thorough. He paused. He was taken because he had inadvertently done business with someone connected to a rival organization. He did not know this. It was not his fault in any sense that the word fault usually means. But fault was not the relevant variable. Proximity was the relevant variable, and he had been in the wrong proximity. He stopped. He looked at the legal pad. He did not draw anything. His wife followed every instruction, he said. Every single instruction. She did not contact the police. She did not speak to anyone outside the family. She gathered the money. She delivered it exactly as instructed, exactly where instructed, exactly on time. The money was received. The family was told he would be returned within 24 hours. He paused for a long time. He was not returned. The journalist waited. He knew faces, the Sicario said. He had been in the house long enough to hear things that could not be unheard. The risk calculation at the end was simple. Release created risk. Non-release eliminated risk. The calculation was made by people above me. I was not part of that decision. I was part of the execution of it. He was quiet. I want to be accurate about that distinction. I was not the one who decided. I was the one who carried out the decision. Whether that distinction matters morally, I cannot tell you. It matters to me only in the sense that it is factually accurate. The journalist did not speak for a moment. He was thinking about the wife. He was thinking about the 24 hours. About what it is to wait for someone who is never coming. To have paid everything and received nothing except the continuation of absence. He was thinking about the 3 daughters. The dog. Do you think about him? The journalist asked. He asked it very quietly. The Sicario took a long time with this one. Longer than with anything else that afternoon. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He picked up the marker and held it and set it down. He looked at the journalist. I think about the space between what I was and what I could have been, he said at last. Not about individual people. Because if I let it become about individual people, the weight of it is not survivable. But sometimes, in the quiet, a detail comes. Something specific. Not the event itself, but a detail around it. The parts of a person that have nothing to do with what happened to them. He stopped. He started again. He had a green jacket, he said. I do not know why I remember that. It is not relevant. It is not useful. It is just there. The green jacket. That is what I have, sometimes, in the quiet. Neither of them spoke for a minute. Outside, a siren moved through the street, rising and falling. Both men listened to it until it was gone. I should tell you, the Sicario said, about what happens to a city when this becomes normal. Please, the journalist said. When violence reaches a certain density, the Sicario said, it stops being experienced as an event and starts being experienced as a climate. Like weather. You do not notice weather unless you are standing in it. You notice cold, you notice wet. You stop noticing the sky. In Juarez, during the worst years, the violence was the sky. It was the medium through which everything else happened. People went to work in it, sent their children to school in it, fell in love in it, ate dinner and watched television and prayed in it. It was the background of every other experience. And like all backgrounds, it became invisible. Not because it was not there. Because it was always there, and the human mind cannot sustain active awareness of a permanent condition without breaking. He was describing, the journalist knew, something that trauma researchers called normalization of violence, the documented psychological process by which communities under sustained exposure to extreme harm develop adaptive mechanisms that allow them to function. The researcher in him recognized the language. The person in him simply felt it as grief. The children, the Sicario said, with the first thing that might be called a sigh. I want to be accurate about the children. He looked at the journalist. The children who grow up in that climate do not know another climate. They do not have a before. They have no template of what ordinary is. And so the extraordinary becomes ordinary, which means the ordinary becomes extraordinary, which means that to be safe, to be protected, to be fed and educated, and to have an expectation of future, those things become not baseline assumptions, but aspirations. Luxuries. He paused. And when the cartel offers those things, even partially, even conditionally, even at a cost that the child will not understand for years, the cartel is offering something real. The legitimate world, which made those promises and did not keep them, is offering something theoretical. He was not excusing anything. The journalist understood that. He was tracing a mechanism, showing how the machine reproduced itself through the next generation, not through coercion but through the simple, devastating arithmetic of offering what the legitimate world had failed to offer. The journalist thought about the 16-year-old boy in the school with the 1,000 pesos and the shoes that fit and the mother's face. He thought about 16-year-olds everywhere. He thought about all the forms that hope takes when the standard containers are unavailable. If you have been listening to this story, you already know it is not a simple one. You know it does not sort neatly into the categories that true crime stories usually sort into: the innocent and the guilty, the victim and the perpetrator, the good and the bad. You know it is a story about systems, about how systems shape people, about what happens to human beings when the structures that are supposed to protect them have been entirely captured by the forces they were designed to oppose. And if any part of you is tempted to put this in a box and close the lid and feel comfortable about it, I am asking you to resist that temptation. Because the story is not finished, and the parts that are still coming are the parts that may cost you the most sleep. So before we go there, take a moment. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you are thinking right now, because I want to know. The journalist had been in that room for more than 5 hours. The afternoon had gone, and the evening was beginning to press against the curtains, turning the light that leaked under them from white to gold to something closer to orange. He had not eaten since morning. He had not thought about food once. He had barely thought about anything except what was in front of him, which was this man and this story and the particular quality of attention that extreme information demands. The Sicario had not moved to leave. He had not shown signs of fatigue. He had not grown impatient or evasive or uncomfortable with the length of the conversation. The journalist understood that this was because the Sicario had agreed to tell his story and was now, in his precise and methodical way, telling it. He had a plan for this conversation the same way he had a plan for everything else. The journalist was not driving it. He never had been. He had simply been invited to observe as it unfolded. The war, the Sicario said. He said it without preamble, as though the word had been waiting in the room all afternoon and had simply found its moment. The journalist knew what war he meant. He had been covering it for years. The conflict that began in Juarez around 2007, when the alliance between the Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel broke down irreparably, when the Sinaloa organization under its leadership decided that the plaza that Juarez controlled was worth taking by force, and when the men who had been running Juarez decided that they would rather burn the city than surrender it. What followed was, by any meaningful measurement, a war. Not a metaphorical war of the kind that politicians declare on drugs or poverty. An actual war with organized armies, territorial objectives, supply chains, casualties, strategy, and a body count that became, for several years, the highest of any conflict in the Western Hemisphere. Before the war, the Sicario said, there was a structure. I want to be accurate about the structure because it is the structure that made everything function. Every plaza had a boss. Every boss had a relationship with the government. Every government official had a relationship with every other plaza. The relationships were managed. They were maintained through regular payments, which were calculated as a percentage of the plaza's income, through favors that flowed in specific directions at specific times, and through the occasional exercise of force that reminded everyone of the costs of deviation. He paused. It was corrupt. It was violent. But it was stable. Stability in the drug trade means thousands of people dying on a managed schedule. That is what stability looks like in that world. The journalist asked about the death of the Juarez cartel's key leadership figures, about the moment when the structure began to fail. The leadership of the Juarez organization had been deteriorating for years, the Sicario said. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the one they called Lord of the Skies, died in 1997 during plastic surgery he had ordered to change his appearance. He was trying to disappear, in a sense, to become someone else. The surgery killed him. After that, his brother Vicente took over, and Vicente was not Amado. The organization felt the difference immediately. He was quiet for a moment. Amado was intelligent. He was strategic. He understood that the value of power is in not having to demonstrate it constantly. Vicente understood power differently. He understood it as dominance that needed to be performed. And performance is expensive. It requires constant violence rather than the threat of violence. And constant violence is economically inefficient. And when you are running a business the size of what the Juarez cartel was running, economic inefficiency is existential. He said all of this the way a business consultant might analyze a corporate failure. No sentiment, no judgment, pure structural analysis. The journalist found it both illuminating and chilling, the chilling quality arising not from what was being described, but from the mode of description, the total absence of the human scale of what he was talking about, the thousands of deaths being analyzed as friction costs in a declining market position. When the Sinaloa moved on Juarez, the Sicario continued. The organization was already fragile. The response was not strategic. It was emotional, reactive. They threw people at the problem. They threw violence at the problem. Every business that got burned, Every neighborhood that got shot up, every police officer who got executed, every journalist who was warned or disappeared, those were not strategic actions. They were the actions of an organization in panic, spending down its capital to hold ground it could feel slipping away. He looked at the journalist. A panicking organization is the most dangerous kind, because it has removed the calculation. It is operating on feeling, and feeling in that world is indistinguishable from chaos. He described the war years with a precision that the journalist had come to expect, but that continued to unsettle him. He described the peer-on-peer killings, the sicarios from one organization hunting the sicarios from the other, the phenomenon that became cruelly known as mutual accounting, where the deaths of operatives from one side were repaid in kind by the other, with interest, so that each cycle of killing required a larger response from the other side. The mathematical spiral of a feud with unlimited participants and no mechanism for de-escalation. He described the amateur recruits brought in to replenish the ranks as the experienced operators died or fled or went to prison, young men from the neighborhoods around Juarez who had none of the training and discipline that the older system had instilled, who brought a chaotic energy to the violence that the established players found both useful and terrifying. The amateurs, the sicario said, and something in his voice changed. Not quite contempt. Something more like the frustration of a craftsman watching his trade be debased. The amateurs killed without calculation, without the three-part structure, without surveillance, without planning, without clean exit. They killed in broad daylight in front of witnesses. They killed the wrong people because their intelligence was bad or non-existent. They killed civilians, not as a calculated message, but as collateral to their own incompetence. And every time they killed a civilian, the city moved further from the kind of stable system that makes the trade sustainable. He meant, the journalist understood, that the violence was destroying the infrastructure it depended on. That a city in full-scale war is not a city through which business can be conducted. That the bodies hanging from overpasses and the decapitations left at school gates and the shootings in shopping centers were not assets to the cartel. They were liabilities. They were what happened when an organization loses control of its own violence, when violence becomes its own end rather than a means to specific ends. He was describing, in his cold, analytical way, the self-destruction of the system he had served, and there was, in his telling of it, something that the journalist might tentatively have called sorrow, though it was a sorrow directed less at the human cost than at the structural failure. And then, the journalist said, it turned on you. The sicario was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, very slowly. I had operated for 20 years, he said. 20 years inside the machine. I knew the faces of the planners. I knew the logistics of the operations. I knew the financial structures. I knew the names of the protected officials. I knew too much. He paused. In a stable system, someone who knows too much is managed carefully. They are given privileges. They are kept close. Their loyalty is cultivated and maintained. The investment in that person's continued silence is understood as a cost of doing business. He looked at the journalist. In a system at war, someone who knows too much is a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities are not managed. They are eliminated. He said this without apparent fear, with the same flat, analytical calm, as though he were describing something that had happened to someone else. When did you know? The journalist asked. When my phone went quiet, the sicario said. In our world, silence is the loudest sound. When the people who have been calling you every day for years stop calling, when the meetings stop being scheduled, when you are excluded from the information flows you have always been part of, that is when you know. Not because they tell you. They never tell you. You tell yourself by reading what is not there. He described the weeks that followed that silence with the precision of someone mapping a shrinking perimeter. The calls he made that were not returned. The contacts he reached out to who received him with a particular quality of vagueness. Not unfriendly, not warm, just carefully neutral in the way that people are neutral when they have been told to be. The realizations that came one at a time, like stones being placed on the pile, each one adding weight, until the weight was impossible to ignore. I tried to leave, he said. It was the simplest sentence he had spoken all afternoon, and it was freighted with everything the simplest sentences carry. How does someone leave? The journalist asked. The sicario looked at him. They do not, he said. That is the answer to your question. There is no leaving. There is only running, which is leaving with the understanding that the place you are running from will follow you. Or there is dying, which is the leaving that the organization prefers. Or there is becoming something so small and so invisible that you stop being relevant, and sometimes, if you are very careful and very lucky, the organization's attention moves elsewhere long enough for you to disappear. He had tried to run. He had used contacts he had built up over 20 years, contacts outside the cartel world, people who owed him things, people he had protected at one time or another, people who existed in the gray zones between his world and the legitimate one. He had moved. He had changed routines, locations, vehicles, phones. He had done everything he had been taught over 2 decades to do when evading surveillance, because he was now on the other side of the surveillance, and he knew exactly how it worked because he had built it. But the thing about running from an organization you were inside, he said, is that you cannot use the invisibility skills you learned inside it. Because they know those skills. They taught them to you. They know exactly how someone trained as you were trained will behave when they are trying to disappear. The evasion patterns you were given are the evasion patterns they are watching for. He paused. I thought I was invisible. I was not invisible. I was predictable. And then he was betrayed. He did not say the word betrayed. He said a friend found him. He said it the way you might describe an encounter that began as something ordinary and became something else entirely, slowly enough that the shift was almost graceful in its horror. The friend, the Sicario said, had not always been an enemy. That was perhaps the most important thing to understand. He was not a person the Sicario had trusted foolishly, naively, without cause. He was a person whose loyalty had been tested over years and had been real as anything in that world could be called real. Someone who had stood beside him in places where standing beside someone required genuine courage. Someone with whom he had shared the particular bond that forms between people who have faced extreme risk together. A bond that has no equivalent in the ordinary world, that is thicker and more adhesive than friendship in the common sense precisely because it has been forged in conditions that destroy everything false. The betrayal, when it came, did not come with drama. It came with a phone call that sounded normal, an invitation to meet at a location that seemed ordinary, the address of a house in a neighborhood the Sicario knew, a neighborhood where he had no reason to feel more exposed than usual. He went. He had been trained for 20 years to read threat, and in those weeks of running, he had become hyper-vigilant, scanning everything, filtering every encounter, trusting nothing that was not verified, and then re-verified. And he went anyway. He went because the voice on the phone was familiar, because the invitation felt like the hand of the old world reaching back for him, offering, if not safety, at least the known. I knew when I walked in, the Sicario said. He said it without visible emotion. Not before. The call was clean. The approach was clean. But when I walked in, I knew. There is a quality to a room when the people in it are waiting for you. Not waiting in the way of people who are glad to see you. Waiting in the other way. There is a stillness in the room that is not natural. That does not belong to people who are at ease. He paused. I had created that stillness myself, in rooms exactly like this one, for other people. I recognized it. He was taken, not killed immediately, because the people who took him wanted something first. Information, names, locations, the knowledge that he carried and that had made him valuable to the organization and now, in the wrong hands, was the reason he was alive in this room rather than in the ground outside it. They were not professionals, the Sicario said. And here, for the first time in the entire afternoon, something crossed his face that was unmistakably contempt. They were amateurs. The new recruits I told you about. Young men who had been given power before they had been given training, who understood violence as spectacle rather than as a tool. They were brutal, but they were not precise. And their lack of precision was what saved me. He described the conditions of his captivity with the same flat accuracy he had applied to everything else. The room, the physical treatment, the questions asked badly, with an amateur's impatience, not understanding that information extracted under uncontrolled conditions is unreliable, not understanding that a trained person can manage what they reveal even under physical duress, can give enough to stay alive without giving enough to compromise anything that could not already be compromised. I assessed them, he said. From the first moment. I was there, and I was hurting, and I was frightened. I want to be accurate. I was frightened. Fear is appropriate information. It tells you the size of the problem. What you do with fear is a separate question. I was frightened, and I was assessing them simultaneously. How many? where they positioned themselves, how they communicated, what they wanted, how far above their competence level they were operating. He paused. They were significantly above it. He realized, over the first several hours, that they had taken him without full authorization from above. That this was in part a personal initiative by one of their leaders, someone with a grudge or an ambition, someone who thought that delivering the Sicario to the organization's hierarchy would purchase something for himself, which meant they had not yet fully reported his capture, which meant there was time. There was a window, small and rapidly closing, in which the calculation of what to do with him had not yet been finalized. "I am still here," the Sicario said to the journalist. That tells you how that window was used. He would not say exactly what had happened. He acknowledged that he had the training and the temperament and the psychological assessment of the room to identify the moment when a different outcome became possible. He did not elaborate. He said only, "There was a moment when I could have killed all of them. I am being accurate. I could have." He paused. "I did not." The journalist waited. He waited a long time. "You prayed," the journalist said. The Sicario looked at him. A faint surprise crossed his face, the first and only surprise of the afternoon. "Who told you that?" he asked. "No one," the journalist said. "It fits." The Sicario held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. He looked at the wall of the motel room, at the particular nothing of a wall with covered windows, and he was quiet for a long enough time that the journalist began to think he would not answer. "I prayed," the Sicario said finally. "I do not know how else to describe it. Not with words. Not with a formula. Not with anything I had ever done in a church, which I had not been in for decades. Something happened in that moment. In the room. With the choice in front of me. Something that was not calculation, not strategy, not the cold assessment that I had been trained to make in every difficult situation. Something that was not from that training." He stopped. Something said to me, not in words, nothing as organized as words, but something said to me that I did not have to be this. That I could be in this moment and not take the action that every instinct I had been given told me to take. He looked at the journalist. I listened to it. And then the moment changed. He was released. He did not know exactly why. The men who had been holding him, faced with the calculation of what he was worth and what he might cost them, made a decision that they had not, he believed, fully thought through. They let him go with warnings that were delivered in the imprecise way of people who are performing authority they do not fully possess. He walked out of the room. He walked through the house. He walked to the street, and the street was ordinary, the evening street of a border city, full of cars and lights and the sounds of other people's lives. And he stood there for a moment and breathed it in. He did not run. He walked. Carefully. Steadily. Without looking back. "And you found God," the journalist said. He kept his voice neutral. The Sicario was quiet for a long moment. "I found something," he said at last. "I will not call it God, because God is a word that belongs to people who have always had access to the concept. I do not know if I have access to it. I know that something changed in that room. I know that I did not take the action I was capable of taking. I know that I came out of that room and I am still alive, which is not a statistical outcome that my life to that point would have predicted." He paused. "Whether that is God or luck or the particular combination of variables that produces unexpected outcomes, I cannot say. But something changed. That is accurate." The journalist asked if he believed the change was permanent. The Sicario considered this very carefully. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at the marker. He looked at the journalist. "I still think the way I was trained to think," he said. "When I walk into a room, I still assess the exits. I still clock the people and their positions and their likely behaviors. I still read the environment the way someone reads a text, looking for variables, looking for threats, looking for advantages. That does not change. That is built into me now as deeply as language, as breathing. You do not unlearn 20 years. He paused. "But the purpose to which I direct that thinking, that has changed. Or I believe it has changed. I am watching it carefully, the way you watch something that has been very sick and seems to be recovering. You are hopeful. You are not certain." He looked at the journalist. "You should not be certain either," he said. "Anyone who tells you that a person like me has been entirely transformed is selling you something. I have been changed. I am changing. It is work. Every day it is work. And I am not sure I am winning." The journalist thought about that. He thought about the difference between the story that is comfortable and the story that is true. About the human hunger for redemption, the way we want the arc of a life to bend toward grace. He thought about 20 years and 250 bodies and a green jacket. He thought about change that was partial and uncertain and effortful and might fail. He thought about whether that kind of change, imperfect and incomplete and honest, was worth more or less than a clean conversion story. He thought it was worth more, precisely because it did not ask you to believe anything comfortable. There is a thing that happens when you have been listening to someone tell you the worst things they have ever done. A thing that happens to your sense of reality, your sense of the distance between people. The journalist had expected, going into that room, to feel the distance between himself and the Sicario as total and unbridgeable. He had expected to sit across from something foreign, and he had found, instead, this. A man who had come from a specific place at a specific time in specific conditions, who had made choices that the journalist could not have made, would never have made, and that still operated according to a logic the journalist could follow. The recognition was not comfortable. It was supposed to be uncomfortable. It was the truth. He asked the Sicario about the contract on his life. About the price. $250,000. The Sicario said. American. This is documented. There is paperwork, if you want to call it that. The kind of paperwork that exists in that world. The journalist did want to call it that. He asked if the contract was still active. In my world, the Sicario said, contracts do not expire. They are fulfilled or they are forgotten. And forgotten is not the same as canceled. Someone with information about my location and the right contact information could claim that money today. Whether the money is still fully there, whether the organization is still in a position to honor it, those are operational questions I do not have current intelligence on. He looked at the journalist steadily. You should know that when you walk out of this room, you carry that information. The information about the contract? The journalist asked. The information about this conversation? The Sicario said. The information that you know where I was on this afternoon. The information that you have my voice on a recording. He looked at the journalist without expression. I am not threatening you. I am informing you. There is a difference. You should be aware of what you are carrying when you leave. The journalist was aware. He had been aware all afternoon. He had made the choice to be here knowing exactly what it might cost him. Not in the abstract way that journalists sometimes romanticize the risks of their profession, but in the specific, body-level way that the desert heat and the closed curtains and the man across from him had made entirely concrete. He nodded once to show he understood. You are not afraid, the Sicario said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. I am afraid, the journalist said. But you stayed, the Sicario said. I stayed, the journalist said. The Sicario looked at him for a long moment. Something passed across his face that the journalist could not identify and would think about for a long time afterward. Something that might have been, in a different man in different circumstances, respect. That is interesting, the Sicario said. And then he went on. He talked about the period after his release. The period of living as a fugitive, not in the dramatic sense of a person running continuously, but in the more mundane and exhausting sense of a person who cannot establish roots, cannot maintain relationships, cannot allow the ordinary patterns of daily life to solidify into something that could be tracked and mapped by someone looking for him. He moved. He changed. He reduced his footprint in the world to the smallest possible surface area. He stopped being someone who could be found in the obvious ways. I had help, he said. He did not say from where. He said that during this period he read. He had always been able to read, had been educated well enough to be a capable reader, but he had never before had the time or the stillness to read in the sustained way he now discovered he was capable of. He read histories. He read theology. He read, somewhat unexpectedly, poetry. He read philosophy in whatever editions he could find in the cities where he stopped. He was trying, he said, to build a framework, a structure that could hold what he had done, not to make it acceptable, not to justify it, but to place it within a larger understanding of what human beings are capable of, so that it did not remain a thing that simply floated in his consciousness without context, formless and therefore impossible to approach. I read about wars, he said, about armies and what soldiers become, about the experiments that psychologists have done to understand how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary violence. I read about systems and about what systems do to the individuals inside them. I was trying to understand myself from the outside, the way you cannot understand yourself when you are inside something, when the walls of the container are also the limits of your perception. He paused. I was trying to build a box that was large enough to hold what I was. The journalist asked if he had found one. I found that the box does not exist yet, the Sicario said. That I may be one of the people who has to help build it. That is perhaps the task. Not to be redeemed in the conventional sense, but to make my experience useful. To say, with accuracy, here is what a system produces. Here is the mechanism. Here is the specific sequence by which an ordinary human being becomes what I became. So that someone somewhere, in some position of influence, might find that useful. Might apply it to the prevention of the next version of this story. He looked at the journalist. That is why you are here. That is why I am talking. Not absolution. Documentation. The journalist thought about that word. Documentation. It was the word of a professional, of someone who understood that the value of information lies in its precision and its preservation. The Sicario was, in his own mind, filing a report. A report on himself, on the system, on the 20 years. A report that he wanted entered into some kind of record, some archive of what actually happened, as opposed to what the news cycle or the government narrative or the romanticized popular culture version would eventually determine actually happened. I need to ask you something, the Sicario said. He had not directed the conversation before. The journalist noted this. Go ahead, the journalist said. Do you believe me? The Sicario asked. Not about the facts. I can see that you believe the facts. I mean about the change. About what happened in the room. The journalist took his time with this. He owed it the time. I believe that something changed, he said at last. I believe you believe that something changed. I believe that the uncertainty you express about the permanence of the change is honest, and that honest uncertainty is more valuable than performed certainty. He paused. I don't know if that is belief in the sense you mean. The Sicario nodded. That is sufficient, he said. The journalist asked about the people the Sicario had known inside the organization who had also tried to leave, who had tried to change. What had happened to them? The Sicario's answer was slow and careful and composed of specific cases described in enough detail to be real, but not enough detail to be identifying. He described men who had tried to negotiate their way out and had been killed in the negotiation. Men who had run and been caught and who were now, as he put it with characteristic economy, no longer relevant to the question. Men who had sought the protection of the American authorities and had entered a witness protection system that had, in some cases, failed to protect them. Men who had turned to the church with varying degrees of sincerity and varying degrees of subsequent history. Most of them, he said, did not make it. Most of the exits from that world lead in one direction. He looked at his hands. I am an anomaly. I do not know what combination of factors produced my anomaly. I have thought about it for many years, and I cannot fully account for it. Luck is part of it. The timing of certain events is part of it. What happened in that room with the choice in front of me is part of it. And perhaps something in my particular constitution that I cannot fully describe, some capacity to be in the worst possible place and still hold a small part of myself outside of it, available to come back. He used the phrase, hold a small part of myself outside of it, and the journalist wrote it down and circled it. It was the most revealing thing he had said about his interior life. The suggestion that even in the deepest immersion in the machine, even at the furthest point from the self he might have been, there had remained a tiny part that was not fully absorbed. A splinter of something. Not conscience, or not conscience in the full sense, but the capacity for conscience. A seed kept in reserve against a season that might never come. The journalist thought about the radio in the other room, about the house getting louder. He asked about the journalist's own safety. Directly. He had been dancing around it all afternoon and decided it was time to ask directly. You came here knowing the risk, the Sicario said. I respect that. The risk to you is real, but it is also, for most practical purposes, managed by the fact that what I have told you is not news to the people who might wish you harm. They know what they are. They do not require documentation to inform them of themselves. The risk is if you publish something that points directly back to them in a way that creates operational exposure. If you are accurate and general rather than specific, the risk is manageable. He paused. I say manageable. I do not say absent. In our world, nothing is absent. He looked at the journalist for a long moment. If something happens to you, he said, because of this conversation, I want you to know that I am sorry. I say that accurately, and I mean it precisely. He picked up the marker. He looked at the legal pad. He put the marker down. That is not something I say very often. It requires a specific kind of accurate grief that I do not have access to about most things. But about you, in this room, having done this, yes. If something happens to you, I am sorry." The journalist said nothing for a moment. He did not know what to say. He was thinking about the precision of the apology, the care with which the Sicario had made clear that the feeling was real and not performed and not general. He was thinking about the 20 years and the bodies and the green jacket and the small part held outside the machine. He was thinking about what it costs to become something and what it costs to try to become something else, and whether the second cost is ever actually paid in full. "Thank you," the journalist said. He meant it. The conversation had turned a corner. The journalist felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, something that registers in the body before the mind names it. The Sicario had, over the past hour, begun to speak differently. Not more openly exactly. He had been astonishingly open throughout, but more personally, with a quality that was, if not intimacy, then something adjacent to it. The quality of a person who has been professionally impersonal for so long that the discovery of an available listener produces something they did not know was waiting to be expressed. He talked about what he missed, not from the cartel world. He was clear about that. Not the money or the power or the structure. He talked about what he missed from the self that had existed before all of it. The boy who had carried books home from school in a neighborhood where dust settled on everything, who had been good at mathematics and had shown it off in ways that made his mother put her hand on his head. He talked about that boy with the kind of distant tenderness with which one speaks about someone you loved who has been gone a long time. He was curious, the Sicario said. That boy, he wanted to know how things worked. Not just machines. People. He observed people the way certain children do, with a quality of attention that adults notice and sometimes find uncomfortable. He watched faces. He watched how people moved when they were lying and how they moved when they were telling the truth. He did not have language for what he was doing. He was just interested. He paused. The organization took that quality and found it useful. They gave it a different purpose. The curiosity did not change. The direction it pointed changed. The journalist asked whether he believed that boy still existed somewhere inside him. I think about that question often, the Sicario said. I do not have a clean answer. There is a continuity, in the sense that the same person has existed through all of the stages I have described. The boy and the young man and the policeman and the operator and the fugitive and the person sitting in this room are all the same thread. But thread changes when you pull it through different materials. It picks up the character of what it passes through. The person I am now has passed through too many materials to be the same as the person who started. He looked at the journalist. But the curiosity is still there. You are here because of it. I agreed to this because of it. I wanted to know what it would be like to tell this story, to hear it said aloud by someone else, to have it exist outside of my own head for the first time. The journalist asked him how he lived now, not in the biographical sense, in the daily sense. What did a day look like? Small, the Sicario said. Deliberately small. I do not have a large footprint. I do not have relationships of consequence. I do not have a home in the sense of a place I am attached to. I move when I need to move. I work when I need to work, small things, nothing that creates visibility. He paused. I pray, not in a building. I do not go to buildings. But I pray in the way that one talks to something larger than oneself, without expecting a conversation, just as an acknowledgement that the conversation is possible. I sleep better than I did during the years inside the machine. I dream badly, but I sleep. He paused again. I read. I think. I watch people on the street with the same attention the boy had. Though now I also carry the knowledge of what people are capable of, and that changes the quality of the watching. He said something then that the journalist would later place at the center of what he wrote. He said, the hardest thing is that I am not obviously worse than the systems that created me. The politicians who negotiated with the organization. The American officials who looked away at the right moments. The business owners who paid protection without asking who they were paying. The journalists who knew the story and did not write it because they had children and a mortgage and a reasonable fear of dying. All of those people made their calculations the same way I made mine. Mine had a more direct relationship to blood. Theirs was more abstract. But the calculation structure was the same. I am not saying I am the same as them. I am not. The blood is real. I carry it, and it is real. He looked at the journalist carefully. But the idea that I am an anomaly, that what I did requires a special category of evil that does not touch the ordinary world, That comfortable idea should be resisted. I am a product of the ordinary world. The ordinary world made me what I am, and it is still making more of me, in different places, with different products, in different uniforms. This was, the journalist thought, the most important thing the Sicario had said. Not the most dramatic, not the most specific, but the most important. The understanding that violence at scale is never the product of exceptional individuals, that it requires infrastructure, and that infrastructure requires cooperation from people who consider themselves ordinary, who consider themselves outside the circle of responsibility, who participate in the conditions that produce violence without ever holding the weapon that delivers it. This was what distinguished this conversation from a crime story. It was not a crime story. It was a story about a system, and the system included everyone who had ever looked the other way. The journalist asked, finally, about the future. What the Sicario believed was coming. For Juarez. For the borderlands. For the cycle that had been running since before either of them was born. The cycle does not end, the Sicario said. That is the honest answer. As long as there is a demand in the north and a supply in the south and a border in between, as long as the differential between what can be earned inside the law and what can be earned outside it remains so large that the calculation is not difficult, as long as the institutions of the state are accessible for purchase and the price is not prohibitive, the cycle does not end. The organizations change. The names change. The faces change. The specific violence changes, it gets worse, then it calms, then it gets worse again. But the cycle does not end. He paused. He looked at the journalist steadily. What could end it? The journalist asked. Several things, the Sicario said. Each one politically impossible for a different reason. You can reduce the demand, which requires treating addiction as a public health crisis rather than a moral failure, and investing accordingly over a generation, not a policy cycle. You can legalize and regulate, which removes the extraordinary profit margin that makes the risk calculation favorable for organizations like the one I was part of. You can rebuild the institutions, the police, the courts, the government at every level, from the ground up, with salaries that do not make corruption a rational choice, which takes 20 years minimum and political will that has not existed. Or, he said, and the journalist heard the word land differently from all the others. You can continue exactly as you are, because the current situation benefits enough powerful people on enough sides of the border that no one with the power to change it has sufficient incentive to do so. He picked up the marker one final time. He drew a circle on the legal pad. Inside the circle, he drew another circle. Inside that circle, another. He drew them until the space ran out. He looked at the diagram for a moment. He turned it so the journalist could see it. Then he set the marker down for the last time and folded his hands on the table. That, he said, is the system. The journalist asked if they could stop for a moment. The Sicario nodded. The journalist stood and moved to the window, and stood with his back to the curtains, not opening them, just needing to be vertical for a moment, needing to feel the weight of his own body in space. He had been sitting across from this man for 6 hours. 6 hours of sustained attention to one of the most complex and disturbing narratives he had ever been asked to hold. His back ached. His head felt overfull. His recorder was still running in his pocket. He turned back. The Sicario had not moved. He was looking at the legal pad, at the concentric circles. There is something else, the Sicario said, when the journalist sat back down. Something I have not said yet, because I was not sure how to say it accurately. The journalist waited. There are people I think about, the Sicario said. Not the ones who died in the operations. Or not only them. There are people I think about who are still alive. People I worked beside for years. People who are still inside the machine, who have not had the particular combination of circumstances that produced whatever this is. He gestured at himself, at the room, at the afternoon they had shared. I think about what it would mean for them to have a different outcome. And I do not know how to want that for them without also wanting that for the people who died. And wanting that for the people who died is not something I know how to do without it being unbearable. So I hold those two things separately, very carefully, in separate containers. And I hope the containers hold. He said this so quietly that the journalist almost missed it. He had been projecting his voice steadily all afternoon, clearly, precisely, as though speaking for a record. This was different. This was speaking for himself. You carry it, the journalist said. Not a question. I carry it, the Sicario said. I will carry it for whatever time I have left. That is not self-pity. That is accurate. The weight of what I have done is real, and it does not lift. What changes is not the weight, but the relationship to it. Whether the weight crushes you, or whether you develop the capacity to carry it. That development is the work. The daily work I mentioned. That is what the work is. He was quiet. On the bad days, I am not sure I am developing. On the better days, I think perhaps I am. The journalist asked him what he wanted people to understand. Not about himself specifically, about the world he had described. The Sicario was quiet for a long time. He looked at the wall. He looked at the circles on the legal pad. He looked at the journalist. I want them to understand, he said, that the children in the neighborhoods around Juarez are not born to this. They are made for it, by a specific set of failures, by a specific sequence of abandonments, by an economy that does not include them, and an education system that does not reach them, and a government that does not protect them, and a border city proximity to wealth that is close enough to see and far enough to never touch. I want them to understand that when a boy of 16 drives a car for 1,000 pesos and feels for the first time that he is real, that he is seen, that he has value in the world, the thing that created that feeling is not the cartel. The cartel is only the one who finally answered. He paused. The question was always there, waiting to be answered. The failure to answer it first, in a better way. That failure belongs to the legitimate world, to the governments and the economies and the policies and the choices. That failure is what creates the market for the answer the cartel provides. And until that failure is addressed, the market will be served. He said it all without raising his voice, without drama, with the same calm precision that had characterized everything he had said since the door of room 164 had opened on this afternoon. And the journalist sat with it and knew it was true and thought about all the places in the world where similar questions were waiting and similar answers were being offered and similar markets were being served and similar people were being produced by similar combinations of poverty and proximity and abandonment and the simple, terrible human hunger to be real in the world. He thought about the boy with the 1,000 pesos and the shoes that fit. He thought about the radio in the other room. He thought about the green jacket. Is there anything you want to say, the journalist asked, to the people who read this story? The Sicario thought for a long time, the longest pause of the afternoon. The journalist waited. Tell them, the Sicario said at last, to look at the systems, not the people. The people are what the systems produce. Tell them that the men like me are not the story. We are the symptom. The story is what creates the symptom. If you want to change the story, change what creates it. If you cannot change what creates it, at least know that it exists. At least stop calling it something foreign. Something that happens over there, beyond the border, in a different kind of world. He looked at the journalist directly. It is your world too. You just have the privilege of not seeing it clearly. That privilege is not permanent. It is conditional on certain choices being made, every day, by people who have the power to make them. When the choices change, the privilege changes. And then you will see what was always there, just across the river, just on the other side of the water. He paused one final time. We are not monsters. We were trained. Everything I was made. The making is the story. Tell the making. The journalist wrote that down. Every word. The session had been going for nearly 7 hours. The journalist's hand had cramped and uncramped and cramped again. The second recorder in his shirt pocket had stopped, and he had not noticed for an unknown period, which meant the first recorder needed to carry the weight. He pressed it through the fabric of his jacket, confirming the steady red indicator light that told him it was still running, still catching every word, still building the document that this afternoon would eventually become. The Sicario showed, for the first time, the slightest sign of tiredness. Not emotional exhaustion, that particular weariness of a person who has spent hours revisiting difficult territory. Something more physical, a slight settling of the shoulders. The quality of a person reaching the end of something they had been carrying for a long time. The journalist recognized it with a pang that surprised him, a kind of solidarity that he immediately mistrusted. This man had carried those stories into the room. He would carry them out again. The journalist was the first person who had ever received them. That was both the privilege and the responsibility of this afternoon. I have one more thing, the Sicario said. The journalist straightened. When you leave this room, the Sicario said, I will watch you leave. I will watch which direction you go. I will note your vehicle. He paused. You should know that. You should know it not as a threat. You should know it because it tells you something important about what I described earlier. About the training that does not leave. He looked at the journalist without apology. I cannot be in a room with someone and not catalog the information available about that person. It is not a choice. It is what I am. When you walk out of here, I will know your license plate. I will remember your face in a way that most people do not remember faces, in the way that my training built into me. I will know these things the way I know how to speak. Automatically, without deciding to. He paused. I tell you this because honesty is the only thing I have left that has value. The honesty of telling you that the wolf does not entirely leave the skin, even when the wolf has decided it no longer wants to be a wolf. The wolf is still there. I am watching it. I am working on it. But I will not pretend it is gone, because pretending it is gone would be the most dangerous thing I could do, for myself and for the people around me. He looked at the journalist steadily. I have not pretended anything to you this afternoon. I am not starting now. The journalist sat with that. He thought about it very carefully, the way you think about something that has two sides, and you want to see both sides before you respond. I believe you, the journalist said. And I am not afraid. The Sicario looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. He picked up the legal pad, and he looked at the diagrams and the words and the concentric circles. He folded the legal pad in half. He folded it again. He held it for a moment, and then he held it out to the journalist. The journalist took it. For the record, the Sicario said. For the record, the journalist agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence. The silence of a conversation that has reached its natural end without either party needing to perform a conclusion. The silence of something that has been said as completely as it can be said and is now settling into the air of the room, finding its place, becoming real in the way things become real when they are spoken aloud and received. The journalist asked one last question. He had been holding it since early in the conversation. He asked it now because there would not be another opportunity and because he was not certain he wanted the answer, but was more certain that he needed it. If you could go back, he said, to the moment you described. The dot on the line. The car. The afternoon. The 1,000 pesos. He did not finish the sentence. The Sicario understood. The Sicario looked at the table for a very long time. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall where the curtains covered whatever the world was doing on the other side of them. He looked at the journalist. I do not know, he said. I have tried to answer that question honestly for years, and I do not know. It is possible that a person in those specific circumstances, with those specific variables, with that specific gap between what existed and what was possible, that such a person was always going to make that choice. That the variables were sufficient to produce the outcome in almost any version of events I can imagine. He paused. But sometimes, in the quiet, I think about what would have happened if someone had been there. Not to stop the choice. The choice was already made before the choice was made. But to see the boy who was making it. To see him fully. To recognize what he was. To say, I see you, and you are worth something. And the world that is about to offer you 1,000 pesos is not the only world. And the world I am going to show you is better, and I am going to stand beside you while you find your way into it. He was very quiet. I think if someone had been there, actually been there, not a program or an institution, but a person who was actually present, the dot might have been different. He said it without bitterness, without accusation, with the same steady, accurate calm that had characterized everything. But it was the most human thing he had said all afternoon. The most vulnerable, the most specific kind of grief, which is not the grief of what happened, but the grief of what might have happened in a different version of the story, a version where someone showed up. The journalist thought about his daughter. He thought about all the children in all the border cities and all the cities that are not border cities where the same variables assemble themselves in slightly different configurations and produce slightly different versions of the same story. He thought about showing up, about what that actually means, about the ordinary human presence of a person who sees another person and does not look away. He did not say any of this. He sat with it in the room, with the Sicario, in the silence that had settled. After a while, the Sicario stood. He moved to the window. He adjusted the curtain slightly, checking something outside that the journalist could not see. He let the curtain fall back. It is safe, he said. You can go. The journalist stood. He gathered his things, the recorder, the notebook, the folded legal pad. He did not shake the Sicario's hand. He did not know if that was the right decision. He moved to the door. He put his hand on the handle. "One thing," the Sicario said. The journalist turned. "Do it accurately," the Sicario said. "Whatever you write, do it accurately. The whole thing. Not the parts that make the story clean. The parts that make it real. The people who read it deserve the real version." He paused. "And so do the people inside the story." "I will," the journalist said. He opened the door. The evening light came in, gold and warm, and smelling of desert and vehicle exhaust, and the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business. He stepped out. He heard the door close behind him. He stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed. He did not look back at the room. He walked to his vehicle. He got in. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and the recorder still running in his jacket and the folded legal pad on the passenger seat. He drove north toward the bridge. What the journalist carried with him out of that motel room and across the bridge and into the weeks that followed was not what he had expected to carry. He had expected to carry outrage. He had expected the particular hot clarity of moral condemnation that is sometimes the product of documented horror, the feeling that makes it possible to write at speed and with conviction about things that should not be. He had carried that out of other assignments. He did not carry it out of this one. What he carried instead was something more complicated and more permanent, something that settled into the tissues rather than burning on the surface. He carried the weight of understanding something he had not understood before, not in his gut, not in the way that changes the architecture of how you see the world. He had understood before this afternoon that violence on the border was the product of systemic failure. He had written about it analytically. He had reported on it empirically. He had held the information at the distance that professionalism requires, and that survival requires when you are a journalist on the border and you cannot afford to feel everything you are looking at. He had not, before this afternoon, understood it from the inside. Not the violence itself. He would never understand that from the inside, and he was grateful for it. But the logic, the progression, the specific sequence by which the world produces a person capable of carrying 250 graves in his body and continuing to breathe. He understood that now, and understanding it was not comfortable. It was not the kind of understanding that makes the world make sense in a reassuring way. It was the kind of understanding that makes the world make sense in a way that keeps you up at night, because it shows you the mechanism, and the mechanism is visible, and visible mechanisms can be changed, and the fact that they are not being changed is a choice, made by people with the power to make it, made every day, and carrying consequences that fall on the people furthest from that power. He thought about the Sicario's concentric circles. He drew them himself one morning on a legal pad. He looked at them for a long time. He turned them over. The journalist's account was published in pieces, in the magazine that had commissioned it, under a byline that did not identify the specific location or the date of the conversation. The pieces circulated. They were read by the people who read serious journalism about the border. They were discussed in newsrooms and in academic departments and in the offices of human rights organizations. They generated the particular combination of praise and controversy that attaches to work that is accurate about things people would prefer to be less accurate about. The journalist received messages, hundreds of them, from people who had been touched by the border violence in personal ways, families of victims, families of perpetrators, the distinction between those two categories being, as the Sicario had suggested, less absolute than the language usually implies. From people who worked in law enforcement on both sides. From people who had grown up in the neighborhoods the Sicario had described, and who wrote to say that the description was accurate, that the world he had painted was the world they had grown up in, and that no one had ever gotten it right before, not like this, not with this particular combination of honesty and refusal to look away. He received one message that he kept. It was brief. It was sent from an address that no longer exists if you try to find it now. It said, "Accurate. Thank you." He knew who had sent it. In the months after the publication, the journalist continued to think about the things the Sicario had said, about training, about systems, about the production of violence through the conditions that make violence rational. He thought about the specific texture of the world the Sicario had described, the world of Juarez at the height of the war years, but also the principles that organized that world, the principles that were not unique to Juarez, that operated wherever the gap between what people are promised and what they are given is large enough to be a door. He thought about all the doors. He thought about the Sicario's question to himself, "Do you believe I have changed?" He thought about his own answer, "I believe that something changed." I believe you believe that something changed. I believe that honest uncertainty is more valuable than performed certainty. He still believed that. He thought about the green jacket. He thought about the radio in the other room. He thought about the dot on the line. The afternoon. The 1,000 pesos. The boy who drove the car because someone had finally seen him and offered him something. Even if what they were offering was the beginning of the end of everything he might otherwise have been. He thought about what it means to show up. To be present for a person at the moment before the moment. To say, I see you, and you are worth something, and the world has more to offer you than this, and I will stand beside you while you find your way into it. He had a daughter. He thought about her every day. He wrote the story as accurately as he could. This is it. Now, before we go on, you have been with this story for a long time now, and that means something. It means you understand that the truth is not always comfortable, but that it matters anyway. If you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. Ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment. Tell me, has this story changed the way you think about the border? About what systems produce? I genuinely want to know. Because the conversation you have in that comment section, the one with strangers who heard the same thing you heard tonight, that is part of what makes this worth telling. What happened to Ciudad Juarez after the war years is a story that does not have a clean ending, because the stories of cities never do. Cities are not novels. They do not resolve. They continue, changed by what they have passed through, but not finished by it, carrying their history in their streets and their silences and the specific quality of their light at certain hours of the day. The peak years of the Juarez violence, the years the Sicario had lived inside so completely, ran roughly from 2008 to 2012. During that period, the city recorded more than 10,000 homicides. 10,000. In a city of roughly 1.5 million people. The mathematics of that are not abstract. They are personal. They are the empty chairs at dinner tables. The school desks that stayed empty. The businesses that closed not because of economic failure, but because the owner did not come to work one morning and did not come the next morning either, and the morning after that was the morning the family understood that mornings were finished. By 2013, the intensity of the violence had decreased. Not ended. Decreased. The Sinaloa cartel had, by a combination of force and negotiation and the particular organizational competence that had made it the dominant trafficking organization in Mexico, consolidated its position in the Juarez corridor. The Juarez cartel, diminished and fragmented, had retreated into a smaller operational footprint. The body count dropped, not to zero, to something that could be described, by the grim standards of the border, as manageable. The city tried to come back. Cities always try. There were initiatives, international and local, investments in public space, in lighting, in community programs. There were journalists and researchers and aid workers and clergy who gave years of their lives to the work of trying to rebuild a social fabric that had been shredded by years of industrialized violence. Some of what they did made a difference. Some of it was absorbed by the continuing reality of poverty and political dysfunction without visible trace. The gap between Juarez and El Paso, the gap between the two cities that share a geography and a sky and nothing else, did not close. It never closed. It is still there. It will be there tomorrow morning when the sun comes up over the Franklin Mountains and falls on both sides of the river. The Sicario, as of the time the journalist last had contact with him, was alive. He did not confirm this directly. The journalist had not heard from him in the way you hear from people you know. He had received, at intervals, the small signals that a person capable of absolute operational invisibility deploys when they want to be found just enough to confirm their continued existence. A message from an address that could not be traced back. A detail in a phone call that served no purpose except to say, I am still here. The journalist received these signals and was relieved by them, and was aware that his relief complicated some things about how he understood the story he had told. He had told the story of a man who had done terrible things. He had told it accurately. He had told it in a way that did not reduce the terrible things to a backdrop for a redemption arc that may or may not have been real. He had told it in a way that kept the victims present, that did not allow the fluency and the intelligence and the philosophical depth of the perpetrator to crowd out the fact of what the perpetrator had done. He had tried, in every version of every piece he wrote, to hold both of those truths simultaneously without letting either one obliterate the other. Whether he succeeded is a question that does not have a final answer. These things are not settled by a piece of writing. They are settled, if they are settled at all, by what the piece of writing does in the world, by the conversations it starts, by the thinking it provokes, by whether any person in any position to change any of the variables the Sicario had identified was, even slightly, moved toward different decisions by reading it. The journalist did not know if that had happened. He still does not know. He wrote it anyway. Some stories have to be told even without the certainty that they will change anything. Sometimes the telling itself is what is owed to the people inside the story. He thought, in the months after publication, about what it means to understand something you cannot fix. This is not a comfortable position. Human beings are more comfortable with problems that admit solutions, with stories that arc toward resolution, with the sense that understanding leads to change, leads to a world that is better than the one you started in. The story of the Sicario, and the story of Juarez, and the story of the border, and the story of what systems do to human beings does not offer that comfort. It offers understanding. Just that. The understanding is real. The change it requires is enormous. And the people with the power to make it have, so far, made different choices. That is where we are. This is the world. There is a river. On one side, the wealth that creates the demand. On the other side, the poverty that creates the supply. In the middle, the border that is a political feature. And through it, the current that moves what moves it, has always moved it, will continue to move it, because the current is powered by forces that no policy in isolation can stop, that require the kind of coordinated, sustained, multi-generational response that has not yet been attempted in the way it would need to be attempted to work. While that response does not happen, the current flows. The boys with the 1,000 pesos make their choices. The cars are driven. The calls are made. The radio code 39 crackles through frequencies that are not monitored in ways that matter. The houses with the covered windows function. The families wait. And somewhere, in a room without windows, or in a borrowed car, or in a city that has a different name than Juarez but the same architecture of conditions, a boy who is curious and smart and hungry and invisible is being seen for the first time by someone who has something to offer. And the thing being offered is real. And the world that is supposed to offer something better has not shown up. This is not a story about evil. This is a story about a system. The system is real. It is operating right now. And it will continue to operate for exactly as long as the decisions that sustain it continue to be made. That is the story. That is all of the story. There is no part of it that is comfortable to hold. And there is no part of it that does not demand something from the person who holds it. Not guilt. Guilt is useless. Not despair. Despair is self-indulgent. What it demands is the same thing the journalist owed to the afternoon in that room, and that the afternoon in that room owed to the people who did not walk out of it. Attention. Accurate attention. The willingness to see clearly, and to say clearly what you see, and to resist the versions that are easier to live with because they are less true. This is what we owe each other. This is what we owe them. A few months after the journalist crossed the bridge back into El Paso, he went home. He went home to the specific, ordinary life that the Sicario had, in his indirect way, described as a kind of gift, the life of someone for whom safety is not a performance, but a baseline, for whom the ordinary morning has not been colonized by violence, for whom there is a daughter and a dinner table and a day that can be lived without a continuous calculation of threat. He went home, and he held these things with a care he had not always felt for them. The specific care of someone who has spent an afternoon in the company of their own absence. He thought about what it means to witness a story, not just to gather it, to receive it, to carry it carefully, to be responsible for it. There are people who tell their stories to one person, and that is all they tell. They tell it once, and then they take it back into themselves and keep it there, because the telling was what mattered, the fact of the story having left the body and been received by another person. The fact of the story being real in the world outside the single skull that has been carrying it. The Sicario had told his story. It had been received. The journalist had been, in that room, the witness. And witnessing, he had come to believe, is a function. Not passive, not merely observation. Active, demanding, morally freighted. To witness a thing is to be responsible for it in some way, to carry it forward with accuracy, to refuse the versions of it that are more convenient. He thought about all the stories that are told and not received. The stories that exist in rooms where there is no journalist with 2 recorders and a notepad. The The stories that disappear into the walls of those rooms and leave no record. The stories of the people who came through the houses with the covered windows and did not come out. The stories of the families who paid everything and received silence. The stories of the boys who drove the cars and never found the exit. All of those stories are real. All of those stories matter. Most of them will never be told to anyone. There is a weight to that. The journalist carries it. He does not think this makes him special. He thinks it makes him accountable. There is a difference. He would write, in the end, more than he expected to write. More than any single piece could hold. The conversations with the Sicario became a book, eventually, rendered as accurately as the constraints of the world and the safety of the people inside the story allowed. The book was read. It was reviewed. It was put on shelves and taken off shelves and discussed in places where discussions of this kind happen. It changed some things for some people in the way that books do when they work, which is to say, it changed the interior furniture. The way a room looks after someone has rearranged it. The same room, different order, different sense of what is possible inside it. Is that enough? Is any of it enough? These are the questions without clean answers that the journalist still lives with. He still lives with them because he is still a journalist, and because the border is still there, and because the system the Sicario described is still running, updated, iterated, with new faces and new methods, and the same underlying architecture of need and neglect, and the terrible efficiency of organizations that understand human desire better than the institutions that are supposed to serve it. He still receives signals, occasionally, that the Sicario is alive. He is glad. And here is the last thing. Here is the thing that keeps him at the desk, and keeps him crossing the bridges, and keeps him sitting in rooms with recorders and legal pads, and the specific focused attention that his job requires. He believes, on most days, with most of his available conviction, that the telling matters, that the story told accurately and received with full attention and carried forward with care does something in the world that silence does not do, that the act of witnessing, of saying, this happened, these people were real, this system is real, this is what it looks like from inside, is an act with consequences. Not guaranteed consequences, not immediate consequences, but consequences that move through the world in ways that are not always visible, touching things you cannot see from where you are sitting, changing the interior furniture in rooms you will never enter. He believes this the way you believe things that you cannot prove, but cannot afford not to believe. The way you believe that a person is worth seeing. That a boy who is curious and smart and hungry deserves to have someone show up. That the radio in the other room should not be drowned out by the noise of a house that has been made deliberately loud. That the wolf and the man who is trying not to be the wolf anymore are both real and both require accounting and both are part of the same story and neither one should be erased for the comfort of the other. The journalist went home. He held his daughter. He ate dinner. He slept badly for a while and then better. He wrote. He remembered an afternoon in a room near the border, across a small table from a man with flat eyes and steady hands and 250 graves in his memory, who had asked to be seen accurately and to whom he had said, "Yes, I will try." He is still trying. On the other side of the river, the lights of Juarez come on every evening in the same sequence they have always come on. The homes first, then the street lights, then the businesses, then the signs along the commercial strips, the whole city lighting itself up against the dark in the way cities have been doing since the first fire was built and the people gathered around it, and the night was held, for a while, at a particular distance. The dark is always there. The fire is always the choice. The Sicario walked out of room 164 and into an evening that was gold and smelled of desert and continued. He noted the journalist's license plate before the car left the lot. He knew the make and the model and the direction of travel and the time. That is what training produces. That is what 20 years inside the machine built into him. The information arrived without effort, slotted into the architecture of his perception as automatically as language, as breathing. He stood at the window behind the curtain and watched the car drive away. Then he sat back down at the table. He looked at the legal pad that the journalist had taken. He picked up the marker that the journalist had left behind. He held it for a long time. He did not draw anything. He set it down very carefully, precisely, parallel to the edge of the table. He turned off the light. He sat in the dark room and he was, as he had said he was, still watching the wolf. Still working. The work never finished. The wolf was still there, in the dark in the way that things trained into you stay in the dark even when you are not looking at them. But he was watching. That is something. In the world he came from, with everything he had done and everything he had carried for 20 years and everything that had been made of him by the machine he had been born next to and fed into. The fact that he was watching, that he had not stopped watching, that the watcher in him had survived and was still at the window and had not looked away, that is something. It may not be enough, but it is something. And in the particular dark arithmetic of this story, something is the closest thing to hope that any honest accounting can offer. The river runs. The lights come on. The morning comes. He says he found God, but his eyes still belong to the wolf. And somewhere, right now, a boy of 16 is being offered 1,000 pesos and a sense of being seen for the first time in his life. And the legitimate world has not yet shown up, and the choice is being made. The dot is being placed on the line, and the car is waiting. That is the story. That is all of it. That is still happening. Now, if this story moved you, if it changed something in the way you see the world tonight, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Leave a comment below and tell me what you were thinking. Tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who thinks the border is a different world, someone who has never had to think about any of this because they have had the privilege of not having to. That privilege is not nothing. Use it. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. Hit the bell, because next time, we go somewhere else. Another story. Another set of truths that need to be told accurately and received with full attention. Another room where someone has something to say that the world needs to hear. I will be here. Thank you for staying until the end. It means everything. This is Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. Good night. Take care of yourselves. And take care of each other.